Hello, and welcome to part 2 of this thrilling historical Western mail order bride romance audiobook. If you're new here, make sure to catch part 1 first for the full story. A huge thank you to our amazing viewers from the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom for your constant support, and a warm welcome to our new listeners from Malaysia, Finland, New Zealand, Australia, Germany, Sweden, Ireland, and Denmark. Thank you for joining us after part 1. Your love and support keep us going. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Let's dive into the next chapter. Chapter 7. The pursuit begins. Pain pulsed through Gideon's skull with each beat of his heart, dragging him reluctantly back to consciousness. The familiar metallic taste of blood lingered on his tongue, and a weight seemed to press against his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. Before opening his eyes, he catalogued his injuries with the detached assessment of a man long accustomed to physical suffering: concussion from the blow to his head, bruised or possibly cracked ribs, various contusions from what must have been a sustained beating after he'd initially fallen. Not life-threatening, just enough to keep him incapacitated while Bishop escaped with Eleanor. Her name sent a jolt of urgency through him more potent than any physical pain. His eyes snapped open, the sudden brightness sending fresh daggers of pain through his skull. "Easy there, Kane," came a gruff voice from nearby. "You've had quite a knocking about." Gideon blinked, forcing his vision to focus. He was lying on a narrow examination table in what he recognized as Doc Simmons' office, a sparse clinical space that smelled of carbolic acid and whiskey. The doctor himself stood nearby, wiping bloody hands on a stained towel. Marshal Dawson leaned against the doorframe, his expression a mixture of concern and wariness. "Eleanor," Gideon rasped, his throat dry as desert sand. "Bishop took her." "How long have I been out?" The two men exchanged a glance that sent a chill through Gideon's core. "Going on 4 hours," Dawson finally replied, straightening from his casual pose. "Bishop and his men rode out hard to the southeast, took Miss Price with them. 4 hours. The knowledge hit Gideon like a physical blow. 4 precious hours of darkness during which Bishop's party could have covered significant territory. He pushed himself upright, ignoring the spike of agony the movement triggered, and the wave of dizziness that followed. Need to go after them now. "Hold on there," Doc Simmons protested, stepping forward with hands raised. "You've got a serious concussion, possible cracked ribs, and I've just finished putting 20 stitches in that gash on your temple. You're in no condition to ride anywhere except back to bed." Gideon fixed the doctor with a cold stare that had made hardened outlaws reconsider their choices. "Not your decision to make," the doctor sighed, recognizing the futility of his protest. "At least let me bind those ribs properly before you go killing yourself." While Simmons wrapped bandages tightly around Gideon's torso, Dawson filled in the gaps of what had occurred after Gideon had been attacked. "Bishop's men created quite the disturbance with that false Apache alarm," the marshal explained, watching as Gideon winced through the bandaging process. "By the time we realized what was really happening, they were already riding out. 4 men besides Bishop, all armed, all looking like they knew their business." "Did they hurt her?" Gideon asked, the question emerging more as growl than speech. Dawson shook his head. "Not that I could see. Bishop had her on his horse, controlled but not injured. Made some speech about the marked woman bringing destruction before they rode out." The marshal's expression tightened with distaste. "Set off all kinds of nonsense among the townsfolk, especially after what happened with the Apache medicine woman during her last visit." Gideon absorbed this information, understanding the calculated nature of Bishop's parting declaration. By linking Eleanor to the Apache prophecy and the chaos that disrupted the celebration, he'd ensured the town would be reluctant to assist in any rescue attempt. "I'll need men," Gideon said, easing himself carefully off the examination table once the doctor finished. "Bishop has at least 4 riders with him. I'll need a posse." Dawson's hesitation told Gideon everything before the marshal spoke a word. "That's going to be a problem, Kane. Folks are spooked. Between the Apache woman's prophecy and Bishop's proclamation, half the town's convinced Miss Price is some kind of harbinger of disaster." "That's superstitious nonsense," Gideon snapped, reaching for his shirt and biting back a groan as the movement pulled at his injured ribs. Maybe so, Dawson acknowledged with a shrug that spoke volumes about his own uncertainty. But that's not all. Bishop left some kind of document with Reverend Parker before he rode out. Official-looking paper claiming Miss Price is wanted back east for theft of Confederate property. Gideon paused, shirt half-buttoned, his mind racing. And people believed that? A man who disrupted their celebration and attacked one of their own? He's got a way about him, the marshal admitted, uncomfortably. He speaks like an educated man, carries himself like someone used to command. And that document had enough official seals and signatures to make folks hesitate, at least. He straightened, meeting Gideon's gaze directly. Bottom line, that woman brought trouble to redemption, just like they said she would. I won't find volunteers for a posse, Kane. Not for her. A cold fury settled in Gideon's chest, more dangerous than any hot-blooded rage. These people had accepted Eleanor's bread at community gatherings, welcomed her smiles and conversation, benefited from her kindness. Yet now, when she needed them most, they retreated behind superstition and cowardice. I don't need their help, he said finally, his voice flat. I'll find her myself. Doc Simmons frowned, his medical concerns overcome by basic humanity. That's suicide, Kane. 1 man against 5, and in your condition? Gideon finished buttoning his shirt, then reached for his gun belt, checking the revolver before buckling it around his hips. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, betraying none of the pain each action triggered. Wouldn't be the first time I've faced worse odds. He turned to the marshal. Which direction exactly? Southeast toward the border? Dawson nodded. Looked that way, though hard to be certain in the dark with all the confusion. Wilkins at the South Guard post thought they were heading toward the old Spanish mission ruins initially, but they could have changed course once out of sight. The Spanish mission. Something clicked in Gideon's mind. The connection to the Apache prophecy. The old cave paintings Eleanor had mentioned from her conversation with the church ladies, Bishop's interest in Spanish land grants, the pieces began shifting into a recognizable pattern. Bishop believes the gold is hidden near the mission, he murmured almost to himself. That's why he needs the cipher key from Eleanor's locket. The markings correspond to something in the caves there. Gold? Dawson perked up, avarice momentarily overcoming his reluctance. What gold? But Gideon had already moved past the marshal toward the door, his mind focused on the path ahead rather than explanations behind. Kane, the doctor called after him. At least take these. He held out a small bottle of laudanum pills for when the pain gets too bad, and try not to die out there. I've spent too much time stitching you up to waste the effort. Gideon accepted the medicine with a curt nod of thanks, then paused at the doorway, turning back to fix the marshal with a hard stare. When I bring Eleanor back, and I will bring her back, remember who stood with her when she needed help, and who turned away. The quiet promise in his voice caused Dawson to flinch visibly. A community reveals its true character in moments like these. Remember that, Marshal. With those words hanging in the air behind him, Gideon stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The town was unnaturally quiet in the aftermath of the celebration, turned disaster, only a few lamps still burning in windows where anxious residents peered out at shadows. Independence Day bunting hung limply from buildings, tattered and forlorn like the broken promise of protection the town had offered its visitors. As Gideon made his way toward the livery stable to claim the horses his friend Mason had prepared, memories surfaced unbidden. His partner Simmons, bleeding out in his arms after Davidson's ambush. The young lieutenant from his cavalry days, who'd relied on Gideon's promise of safety only to die in a Confederate prison. His sister's face when he'd told her their parents were dead. Failures. Moments when he hadn't been enough, hadn't been fast enough or strong enough or smart enough to protect those who counted on him. Now Eleanor's face joined that haunting gallery, her eyes wide with fear as Bishop dragged her away. Her desperate glance back, seeking reassurance even as he fell beneath his attacker's blows. Not this time, Gideon muttered to the silent streets around him. Not her. Not again. The vow carried the weight of an oath as he disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, a solitary figure against the vast indifference of the frontier and the calculated cruelty of the men he pursued. The homestead stood silent in the gray light of early morning as Gideon approached. After arranging for supplies and fresh horses from Mason at the livery, the only man in Redemption who'd offered help without hesitation, he had ridden hard to reach the cabin before full daybreak. Every moment increased the distance between Eleanor and safety, but he knew from bitter experience that rushing headlong into pursuit without proper preparation would only lead to failure. He dismounted carefully, ribs protesting the movement despite the tight binding. The cabin seemed to watch him reproachfully as he approached, as if blaming him for returning alone, for failing to protect the woman who had brought warmth and purpose to its once austere interior. The door swung open at his touch, exactly as he'd left it when they'd departed for the celebration just yesterday, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. Inside, evidence of Eleanor's presence was everywhere. The blue calico curtains she'd sewn from the fabric he'd given her, the arrangement of plates on the shelf, rather by size rather than stacked haphazardly as had been his habit, a vase of wildflowers on the table, likely gathered yesterday morning before they left, now beginning to wilt without her attention. Gideon moved through the main room toward his bedroom, each homely detail another twist of the knife in his conscience. He had brought her here, promising safety while knowing, or at least strongly suspecting, that Thomas Mitchell's interest in her had dangerous implications. He had delayed telling her the full truth, believing he was protecting her, when in fact he'd only made her more vulnerable through ignorance. In his bedroom, he pulled a worn canvas rucksack from beneath the bed and began gathering essential supplies for the pursuit: ammunition, jerky, hardtack, water canteens, medical supplies. His movements were economical despite his injuries, honed by years of pursuing dangerous quarry across unforgiving terrain. As he reached for his spare shirt, he noticed something different. The torn sleeve had been mended, the careful stitches nearly invisible against the faded blue fabric. Beside it lay a small tin of salve, the kind Eleanor prepared from local plants for treating wounds and burns. A folded scrap of paper leaned against the tin, his name written in her neat, flowing script. Gideon unfolded the note with fingers that were suddenly less steady than they had been when checking his weapons. Gideon, your spare shirt needed mending, and I thought you might require more salve after your journey to Tucson. Apply it twice daily to prevent infection. Take care and return safely. Eleanor, no flourishes, no excessive sentiment, just practical concern, expressed straightforwardly exactly as she'd come to know him. The simple evidence of her care struck Gideon more powerfully than any elaborate declaration might have. She had prepared for his journey to Tucson. The journey he'd repeatedly postponed, telling himself it was due to ranch responsibilities or rumors of Davidson gang activity. In truth, he'd delayed because leaving Eleanor had become increasingly difficult with each passing day, each shared meal, each evening spent reading by lamplight while she worked on her mending. He placed the note carefully in his breast pocket, tucked the tin of salve into his pack, and reached for the mended shirt. As he pulled it on, he caught the faint scent of lavender. Eleanor had taken to storing linens with sprigs of the plant she'd cultivated in a sunny corner of the garden. The garden. Another transformation she'd wrought during her residence. What had been a struggling patch of vegetables when she arrived had flourished under her attention. Rows of corn standing tall, beans climbing their poles, tomatoes ripening in the summer heat. She had spoken of canning the harvest, planning for winter months ahead, implicitly assuming a future here, with him. Gideon moved to the locked chest in the corner, the one Eleanor had noticed but respectfully left unopened during her time at the homestead. The key hung on a leather thong around his neck, had hung there since he'd first realized the significance of his wartime intelligence reports after the war's end. The lock clicked open and he lifted the heavy lid to reveal the contents. Carefully preserved Confederate documents, maps marked with troop movements and supply caches, insignia and coded messages collected during his cavalry service. Beneath these lay a leather folio containing more recent additions, newspaper clippings about missing Confederate treasury shipments, reports from contacts about Bishop's movements over the years, and sketches of locket designs that matched the description of Eleanor's family heirloom. He had begun collecting this information years ago, driven initially by a soldier's determination to see justice served against men like Bishop who had committed atrocities under the cover of war. Over time, as rumors of hidden Confederate gold persisted, his interest had evolved, not from greed, but from conviction that such resources should not remain available to fund lingering rebellion or criminal enterprises. When Thomas Mitchell's inquiries about Spanish land grants and family heirlooms had raised flags among Gideon's network of informants, he had begun tracking the man, suspecting a connection to Bishop's long-rumored quest. Eleanor's arrival had complicated everything. The innocent pawn in a dangerous game, unwittingly carrying the key Bishop had sought for years. Gideon removed several maps of the territory surrounding the old Spanish mission, carefully tracing the routes Bishop might take. He added these to his pack along with a small leather case containing tools for picking locks. Eleanor's locket would certainly be secured once Bishop obtained it. As he worked, memories of Eleanor continued to surface. Her laughter during their target practice, the determined set of her jaw when mastering a new skill, the softness in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. She had entered his life as an obligation, transformed into a companion, and now she had become more precious to him than any treasure or bounty he had ever pursued. The realization struck with unexpected force. Gideon paused in his preparations, one hand braced against the wall as he absorbed this truth. His pursuit of Bishop had been driven by justice, duty, the determination to prevent dangerous resources from falling into dangerous hands. But Eleanor's rescue transcended all these motivations. He loved her. Somehow, between shared meals and quiet evenings, between her reorganization of his pantry and her quiet acceptance of his scars, both visible and hidden, she had become essential to him in a way no one had been since before the war. The knowledge steadied him, focused his determination to a razor's edge. Bishop might have men, resources, and a head start, but Gideon possessed something far more powerful. The absolute certainty that Eleanor Price belonged here, in this home they had created together, not in Bishop's grasp as a means to satisfy years of obsession with lost Confederate gold. Dawn had fully broken by the time Gideon finished his preparations. Outside, he loaded his supplies onto Solomon, the ornery gelding that had somehow developed a grudging respect for Eleanor during her time at the homestead. The horse stamped impatiently, as if understanding the urgency of their mission. "We'll find her, old boy," Gideon murmured, checking the cinch one final time, "and bring her home." Solomon snorted, tossing his head as if in agreement. With a final glance at the cabin, no longer just a shelter, but a home since Eleanor's arrival, Gideon swung carefully into the saddle. Pain lanced through his ribs, and his head throbbed where Doc Simmons' stitches pulled at the wound. But he pushed the discomfort aside with practiced discipline. Physical pain was nothing compared to the thought of Eleanor in Bishop's hands, frightened and alone, believing perhaps that no one was coming for her. Gideon eased Solomon into a ground-eating lope, heading southeast toward the Spanish mission ruins where Bishop had almost certainly taken her. The rising sun cast his shadow long across the trail ahead, one man riding alone to face multiple adversaries, injured and outnumbered. The odds would have given most men pause, but Gideon Kane was not most men, and Eleanor Price was not most women. She was the woman who had transformed his solitary existence with her quiet strength and unassuming courage. The woman who mended his shirts and prepared salve for wounds she couldn't see but somehow understood. The woman whose presence had made his house a home, and he would find her, whatever the cost. The sun had climbed halfway to its zenith when Gideon directed Solomon off the main trail toward the Apache encampment. Though Bishop's party had headed southeast toward the Spanish mission, Gideon knew that pursuing them alone, injured and with only the most obvious tracks to follow, would likely end in failure. Pride had no place in a rescue mission, and Eleanor's safety mattered more than any reluctance to seek assistance, even from those the white settlers of redemption regarded with suspicion and fear. The Apache camp occupied a sheltered draw between two low hills, its location offering both protection from harsh winds and excellent visibility of approaching riders. Gideon noted the strategic positioning with grudging appreciation as he approached at a deliberately unhurried pace, his right hand raised palm outward in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. He had traveled less than halfway down the slope toward the camp when the first Apache warriors materialized from seemingly nowhere, appearing from behind scrub and rock outcroppings where they had been perfectly concealed. Within moments, 6 men surrounded him, their faces impassive, but their weapons, both traditional and the occasional modern rifle, held with unmistakable readiness. Gideon reined Solomon to a halt, keeping his hands visible and his expression neutral despite the relentless throbbing of his injured ribs and the pounding in his head. The gelding snorted nervously, sensing the tension, but remained steady beneath him. "I seek the medicine woman," Gideon said clearly, using the few words of Apache he had learned during his years in the territory. When his limited vocabulary failed him, he continued in English, hoping someone would understand. "About Eleanor Price, the woman with the marked wrist. Bishop has taken her." The warriors exchanged glances, their expressions revealing nothing to untrained eyes. But Gideon had spent years reading men's faces for the slightest betrayal of thought or intention, and he detected both recognition and concern at Eleanor's name. One warrior spoke sharply to another, who disappeared back toward the camp with fluid swiftness. The remaining men continued their silent vigilance, neither advancing nor retreating, their weapons neither raised for immediate threat nor lowered in welcome. Minutes stretched like hours as Gideon waited, acutely aware that he sat exposed on horseback while surrounded by men who had ample reason to distrust any white visitor. His reputation as a manhunter was well known throughout the territory, and though he had never pursued Apache except when sanctioned by their own tribal justice, association alone was often enough to breed suspicion. Finally, movement at the camp's edge caught his attention. The elderly medicine woman he'd glimpsed during the Independence Day celebration emerged, walking with the dignified deliberation of advanced age, supported by undiminished authority. Beside her walked a younger man, tall and lean, with the watchful eyes of a scout. Gideon recognized him as the translator who had approached Eleanor during the festivities, warning her of danger that had arrived all too swiftly thereafter. The warriors parted to allow the pair through, though their weapons remained ready. The medicine woman studied Gideon intently, her dark eyes missing nothing, not the fresh stitches at his temple, nor the careful way he held himself to minimize strain on injured ribs, nor the intensity of purpose evident in every line of his body despite his wounds. "Grandmother says you come seeking the marked woman," the young translator spoke, his English clear though accented. "I am Nakohe. She knew you would come." Gideon inclined his head respectfully toward the old woman. "Bishop took Eleanor during the celebration. I need to find her, but the trail is already hours old, and I don't know this territory as well as your people," Nakohe translated, his hands moving in expressive gestures that complemented his words. The medicine woman listened, her eyes never leaving Gideon's face. When the translation finished, she spoke at length, her voice carrying the musical cadence Gideon associated with Apache language, but with an underlying gravity that transcended linguistic barriers. "Grandmother says she saw this happening," Nakohe translated when she finished. "In dreams 3 nights past, she watched the gray wolf take the marked woman into darkness. She has been preparing for your arrival since then." "Gray wolf?" Gideon frowned. "The one you call Bishop," Nakohe clarified. "Grandmother sees people's spirit animals. This man's is Gray Wolf. Clever hunter, but one who sometimes feeds on the dead or weak, rather than proving his strength against the strong." The assessment aligned eerily with Gideon's own impression of Bishop, a shrewd tactician who preferred advantages of position and numbers rather than direct confrontation. He nodded slowly. "Where has he taken her? To the Spanish mission?" The medicine woman spoke again when Nakohe translated the question, her gnarled hands gesturing toward distant mountains. "She says the gray wolf seeks the sleeping eagle," Nakohe explained. "The place your people called Santa Elena Mission is only the beginning of his path. His true destination is the abandoned silver mines beyond the mission. Las Aguilas, the eagles, old Spanish diggings where many died, both my people and yours." Gideon absorbed this information, mentally adjusting his understanding of Bishop's objective. The silver mines made strategic sense. Remote, defensible, with a network of tunnels that would be nearly impossible to assault directly. If he recalled correctly, they had been abandoned decades earlier after a collapse killed numerous miners. earning a reputation for being cursed among the superstitious. "I need a guide," Gideon said directly, looking at Nakohe rather than the warriors who still surrounded him. "Someone who knows the desert paths, the water sources, the approaches to the mines that Bishop might not anticipate." Nakohe translated for the medicine woman, whose response was immediate and accompanied by a pointed finger directed at the translator himself. "Grandmother says I will guide you," Nakohe said, surprise evident in his voice. "She says it is my path to follow, that I have been preparing for this journey without knowing it." One of the warriors protested sharply, stepping forward with evident disagreement. A heated exchange followed, with the medicine woman responding with such commanding presence that the warrior eventually stepped back, dissatisfaction clear in his posture, but unwilling to challenge her authority further. "Not all agree," Nakohe explained unnecessarily. "Some believe white men's conflicts should remain white men's problems." "And you?" Gideon asked, studying the young Apache's face. "What do you believe?" Nakohe considered the question with a seriousness Gideon had rarely encountered in men twice his age. "I believe the prophecy has many parts, not just the warning that frightens the town people," he said finally. "Grandmother has taught that the marked woman's coming was foretold generations ago, when Spanish soldiers first brought death to these mountains." The medicine woman spoke again, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of formal recitation. Nakohe listened intently, then translated with equal care. "The marked woman will bring ruin to those with greed in their hearts, fortune to those pure of spirit," he recited. "Where destruction is seen, renewal will follow. What is taken by force must be given freely to bring life instead of death." The words hung in the still desert air, carrying weight beyond their immediate meaning. Gideon thought of Eleanor, her quiet strength, her adaptability, the dignity with which she had faced each challenge since arriving in the territory. There was truth in the prophecy's description, whether one believed in supernatural foreknowledge or merely recognized the impact one person of integrity could have on those around them. "I believe this part of the prophecy," Nakohe continued, meeting Gideon's gaze directly. "I have seen the marked woman's eyes. There is no darkness there, only light that has been tested by suffering. If she is in danger because of the gray wolf's greed, then I will help free her." The medicine woman nodded approvingly at his words, then gestured for Gideon to dismount. He complied, controlling his expression despite the pain the movement triggered in his injured ribs. She approached him without hesitation, her wrinkled hands reaching up to frame his face with surprising strength. Her dark eyes bored into his with unnerving intensity, as if reading truths written on his soul rather than merely examining his physical being. After a long moment, she nodded once, decisively, and spoke to Nakohe. "Grandmother says you carry many wounds, some visible, some hidden," he translated. "She says your spirit animal is the mountain lion, solitary hunter, protective of territory, fierce in defense of what is claimed as his own." A slight smile touched Nakohe's lips. "She approves of this, says the marked woman needs such protection." The medicine woman released Gideon's face and turned toward her camp, gesturing for them to follow. The warriors parted, their stance less threatening, though still watchful, as Gideon led Solomon after the elderly woman, Nakohe falling into step beside him. "She will perform a blessing ceremony before we leave," Nakohe explained quietly. "To strengthen your wounds and clear our path. It would be disrespectful to refuse." "I'm not in the habit of refusing help, whatever form it takes," Gideon replied, his voice equally low. "How soon can you be ready to ride?" "I need only my weapons and medicine pouch," Nakohe said. "My horse is fast and knows me well. We can leave when grandmother is finished with her ceremony." They reached the center of the camp, where a small fire burned despite the day's heat. The medicine woman gestured for Gideon to sit on a blanket near the flames, then disappeared into a nearby wickiup, returning moments later with a small pottery bowl containing a pungent paste and several leather pouches. What followed was unlike anything in Gideon's experience, a ceremony that blended practical medicine with spiritual elements he only partially comprehended. The medicine woman applied the paste to his temple wound and bound his ribs with fresh bandages while chanting in a low melodic voice. She burned herbs in the fire that released fragrant smoke, using an eagle feather to waft the vapors toward him in sweeping motions. Throughout, Nakohe translated when explanations seemed necessary, though much of the ceremony proceeded in silence, broken only by the medicine woman's occasional chants and the crackling of the fire. "She says your body will heal faster now," Nakohe said as the ceremony neared its conclusion. "The pain will remain to remind you of caution, but it will not cloud your thinking or slow your reactions when they are most needed." Gideon nodded his thanks, respecting the solemnity of the occasion, regardless of his personal beliefs about such practices. Whatever forces guided the universe, Christian God, Apache spirits, or simply the natural laws of an indifferent cosmos, he had lived long enough to know that certainty in such matters was the luxury of those who had experienced little of life's complexity. As a final act, the medicine woman removed a small leather pouch from around her own neck and placed it in Gideon's palm, closing his fingers around it with both her hands. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of formal pronouncement. "Protection against dark forces," Nakohe translated. "Grandmother says to wear this against your skin when you enter the eagle's domain. The mountain spirits remember the blood spilled in those tunnels and may mistake your purpose unless you carry this sign of our people's blessing." Gideon accepted the talisman with appropriate gravity, slipping the leather cord around his neck and tucking the pouch beneath his shirt. The medicine woman nodded approvingly, then spoke directly to Nakohe in rapid Apache that required no translation, clearly instructions or warnings meant for her tribesmen alone. "I will prepare my horse," Nakohe said when she finished. "We should leave within the hour if we hope to reach the mission area by nightfall." As the young Apache departed to gather his supplies, Gideon found himself alone with the medicine woman. She studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see far more than his physical presence, then spoke in halting English, the first he had heard from her. "Marked woman, special," she said, tapping her chest over her heart. "You understand this." "Yes," Gideon replied simply. "I understand." She nodded, satisfied, then added with surprising clarity, "Bring her back. She belongs here." Whether here meant the Apache territories, the Arizona frontier, or specifically Gideon's homestead remained ambiguous, but the conviction behind the statement was unmistakable. Eleanor Price belonged somewhere other than Bishop's captivity, and the old woman was entrusting Gideon with ensuring her return. "I will," he promised, the words carrying the weight of an oath. The medicine woman smiled for the first time, transforming her weathered face with unexpected warmth. "I know," she said, and turned away. The audience clearly concluded. An hour later, Gideon and Nakohe rode away from the Apache camp, heading southeast toward the distant mountains where the Spanish mission and silver mines awaited. Behind them, the medicine woman stood watching their departure, her hand raised in what might have been blessing, or farewell, or perhaps simply acknowledgement of forces set in motion long before any of them had drawn breath. The desert stretched before them, a harsh landscape of sun-baked earth, scattered mesquite, and occasional outcroppings of rock that provided the only respite from the relentless June heat. Gideon and Nakohe rode single file along a game trail, following tracks that would have been invisible to less experienced eyes. Displaced stones, bent vegetation, occasional scuffs in the hardpan where horseshoes had struck with particular force. Bishop's party had indeed headed toward the Spanish mission initially, making little effort to conceal their passage. 5 riders moving at speed, one horse carrying double weight. The signs were clear to Gideon's trained gaze, confirming that Eleanor remained physically unharmed enough to ride rather than being transported by less gentle means. "They are confident," Nakohe observed, bringing his pinto stallion alongside Gideon's gelding where the trail widened slightly. "They leave signs a child could follow." "Bishop's arrogant, not careless," Gideon corrected, pointing toward a distant rise. "He's leaving an obvious trail to the mission because that's where he wants pursuers to go. I'd wager there's an ambush waiting there for anyone following directly." Nakohe studied the terrain ahead, then nodded slowly. "The mission ruins offer many places for men with rifles to hide," he agreed. "How did you know this bishop would think this way?" "War teaches you to predict how men think when their lives depend on strategy," Gideon replied, adjusting his course slightly to follow a dry wash that paralleled the main trail but offered more concealment. The Bishop was known for setting traps, making his forces appear vulnerable, then surrounding enemies who took the bait. "You fought against him?" Nakohe asked, guiding his mount carefully down the washed, sandy bank. "Not directly. Our units encountered each other only once, near the end of the war." Gideon's expression darkened with memory. "My cavalry company captured some of his men after a skirmish. One was wounded badly. A young lieutenant barely older than you. Feverish, confused. He talked about things Bishop had ordered during previous engagements." Nakohe waited silently as Gideon gathered his thoughts. The only sounds, the soft thud of hooves on sandy ground, and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. The lieutenant described massacres of Union prisoners, wounded men shot rather than treated, captives executed to avoid the burden of transporting them. Gideon's voice remained even, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. When the fever broke, he denied everything, terrified we'd use his testimony against his commander. But I believed what he said in delirium more than his coherent denials. "Many bad things happen in white men's wars," Nakohe observed, his tone neither judgmental nor excusing. "My father told stories of both bluecoats and graycoats who killed without honor during those years." Gideon nodded grimly. "There were atrocities on both sides, but Bishop made it policy rather than exception. And after the surrender, when most Confederate officers accepted parole and returned to rebuild civilian lives, he disappeared with several loyal men." "To search for this gold Eleanor's locket helps locate?" Nakohe asked, demonstrating he had already pieced together parts of the situation from his conversation with the medicine woman. "That's my belief," Gideon confirmed. Confederate treasury shipments went missing during the war's final days. Gold meant to fund continued resistance if Richmond fell. Most assumed it was captured or stolen by deserters, but rumors persisted of caches hidden in remote locations, waiting for the right moment to fund a resurgence. They rode in silence for a time, each man absorbing the implications of Bishop's obsession, carried forward more than a decade after Appomattox had supposedly ended hostilities. The sun climbed toward its zenith, heat shimmering off the hard pan in distorting waves that made distant landmarks appear to float above the earth. When they stopped briefly to rest the horses in the meager shade of a rock formation, Nakohe produced a small cloth bundle from his saddlebag. Opening it revealed dried meat, unlike the jerky Gideon carried. Darker, more aromatic, preserved with unfamiliar spices. "Venison," Nakohe explained, offering a portion. "Prepared with desert herbs that help the body resist heat sickness. You should eat. The medicine woman's treatment is strong, but healing requires fuel." Gideon accepted the offering with a nod of thanks. The meat was tougher than standard jerky, but carried complex flavors that lingered pleasantly on the tongue. As they ate, he found himself studying his unlikely companion more carefully. Nakohe appeared to be in his early 20s, with the sinewy build of a man accustomed to covering long distances on foot or horseback. Unlike the stereotypical image of Apache warriors in popular newspapers and dime novels, he wore a practical mixture of native and adopted clothing. Buckskin leggings, moccasins that left minimal tracks, but also a cotton shirt clearly obtained through trade with settlers. A rifle of recent manufacture was secured to his saddle, while more traditional weapons, a knife, a short bow, and a quiver of arrows completed his armament. Most striking were his eyes. Not just their keen observational quality, which Gideon had noted immediately, but their expression of thoughtful intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond tribal boundaries. "You speak English better than most interpreters I've encountered," Gideon observed. "Where did you learn?" "Mission school for 3 years," Nakohe replied, taking a drink from a water skin fashioned from animal bladder. "Until my father decided the black robes were too interested in changing more than just my language." The statement carried no evident bitterness, merely pragmatic acknowledgement of cultural conflict. Nakohe offered the water skin to Gideon, who accepted it despite having his own canteen. The liquid within proved remarkably cool despite the day's heat. "Desert willow bark and rabbit bush added to the water," Nakohe explained, noting Gideon's surprise at the temperature. "Helps keep it cool longer. Small things matter when traveling far from reliable water sources." Gideon nodded his appreciation for both the drink and the knowledge. "Any other desert wisdom I should know about?" My tracking usually keeps me in more forgiving territory. A hint of smile touched Naho's serious expression. Many things. Watch for snakes beneath rocks like these when making camp. The creatures that can kill you move most actively at dawn and dusk. If we run short on water, barrel cactus holds emergency moisture, but prickly pear provides both water and food if prepared correctly. As they resumed their journey, Nakohi continued sharing survival information. Which plants indicated underground water sources nearby, how to recognize approaching dust storms before they became visible on the horizon, methods for navigating by sun and stars when landmarks disappeared in the desert's deceptive sameness. In exchange, Gideon found himself explaining tracking techniques he'd developed during years of pursuing fugitives, how to distinguish a man's unique gait from boot prints alone, ways to determine how long ago a campfire had been extinguished, methods for calculating a quarry's probable destination based on terrain and available resources. Their conversation, practical rather than personal, nevertheless forged an unexpected connection between men from vastly different worlds, united by a common purpose. By mid-afternoon, when they paused again to rest the horses and study the terrain ahead, the initial wariness had given way to nascent professional respect. Bishop's party is pushing hard, Gideon observed, examining fresh tracks where their route briefly intersected the more obvious trail. 5, maybe 6 hours ahead of us still, but the horses are tiring. See how the prints are dragging more here than earlier? They'll need to make camp soon if they don't want to lame their mounts. Nakoya nodded agreement, then pointed toward distant mountains, shimmering in the late afternoon heat. The mission lies in that valley. The mines are beyond, higher in the foothills. Less water, more difficult terrain. If they camp, it will be near the mission's old well, the only reliable water between here and the mountains. Can we reach it by nightfall? Gideon asked, calculating distances and remaining daylight. If we push hard, yes, Nakohe confirmed. But they will have sentries watching the approach. Better to camp short of the mission, approach before dawn when night guards are least alert. The strategy aligned with Gideon's own thinking. Agreed, we'll find a defensible position for the night, continue at first light. They rode steadily through the afternoon, Nakohe occasionally directing them to small seeps or hidden springs that prevented their water supplies from diminishing too rapidly. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, turning the desert to molten copper, Gideon's thoughts increasingly turned to Eleanor, picturing her riding double with Bishop, uncertain of her fate or whether anyone pursued. You are very quiet, Nakoe observed as they navigated a stretch of broken ground. Thinking of the marked woman? Gideon nodded, seeing no purpose in denial. Wondering how she's faring. Eleanor isn't accustomed to such hardships. Yet she survived alone at your homestead while you tracked the Davidson gang, Nakohe pointed out. Grandmother says she has the strength of old souls in her spirit. Your grandmother seems to know a great deal about Eleanor, Gideon noted, curious despite his pragmatic focus on the pursuit. What does Eleanor's birthmark signify to your people? She mentioned being called the marked woman when she encountered your medicine woman in town. Nakohe was silent for a long moment, as if deciding how much to share with an outsider. Finally he spoke, his tone carrying the cadence of formal teaching rather than casual conversation. The crescent mark is rare, but known to our storytellers, he explained. It signifies one who stands between worlds, not just the world of Apache and white settlers, but deeper divisions, life and death, past and future, destruction and creation. Someone who bridges different realities, Gideon murmured, recalling Eleanor's ability to adapt to frontier life while maintaining the grace and dignity of her Boston upbringing. Yes, the old stories say such marked ones appear when great changes come to the people. They can bring renewal or ruin, depending on how they are treated and what forces guide their path. Nako had glanced at Gideon, his expression serious. Bishop seeks to use her for his own purpose, the mark, the locket she carries. This bends the prophecy toward darkness. And what would bend it toward light? Gideon asked, finding himself drawn into the Apache perspective despite his usual pragmatism. Her free choice, her true path, not one forced upon her. Nakohe looked toward the mountains, now turning purple with approaching evening. Grandmother believes she was meant to come here, but not as Bishop's prisoner or even as Mitchell's unwitting wife, for her own purpose, which is still revealing itself. The conversation stirred uncomfortable questions in Gideon's mind. Had he, too, bent Eleanor's path by offering shelter that served his own investigation of Mitchell? By developing feelings for her that prompted him to delay explaining the full truth about her locket and its connection to Bishop? "We may camp there," Nakohe said, interrupting Gideon's troubled reflections as he pointed toward a small rise crowned with boulder formations. "High ground, good visibility, some shelter from night winds. We can see the Mission Valley from its peak." They made their way to the designated spot, a natural fortress of tumbled rocks that offered concealment for both men and horses, while providing excellent sightlines in all directions. As Nakohe gathered sparse vegetation for a small, nearly smokeless fire, Gideon climbed to the highest point of the formation to study their destination through his field glass. The Spanish mission, or what remained of it, lay approximately 3 miles distant, its adobe walls glowing rose gold in the setting sun. Once an outpost of European civilization in a harsh landscape, it had been abandoned for decades, its purpose nullified by changing political boundaries and the decline of Spanish influence. Now it served as shelter for occasional travelers, including, Gideon noted with grim satisfaction, Bishop's party. Thin wisps of smoke rose from within the mission's roofless walls, confirming Nakohe's prediction that they would make camp at the only reliable water source in the area. Through the powerful glass, Gideon could make out figures moving about the ruins. Men securing horses, gathering firewood, establishing a perimeter. No sign of Eleanor, though. She was likely being kept inside what remained of the mission buildings. He counted 6 men, including Bishop, one more than had participated in the abduction at Redemption. Perhaps they had arranged to meet additional Confederates at this location, which would further complicate rescue efforts. When he returned to their small camp, Nachko had prepared a meager but adequate meal from their combined provisions. As they ate, Gideon shared his observations, and together they developed a strategy for approaching the mission before dawn. "The mines are here," Nakohe said after their meal, sketching a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "Old Spanish diggings abandoned after a major collapse killed many workers. The main entrance is here, facing east, but there are smaller shafts higher up the mountainside where air vents were created." "Defensible?" Gideon asked, studying the crude but informative drawing. "Very. One man with a rifle could hold the main entrance against many attackers." Nakohe added details to his sketch. "Inside is worse. Tunnels branch in many directions, some stable, others dangerous. Easy to become lost or trapped." "You've been inside?" Gideon raised an eyebrow, surprised. Nakohe nodded. "As a youth, before the medicine woman took me for training, young men of the tribe sometimes prove courage by entering forbidden places." A shadow crossed his face. 2 did not return that day. Since then, the mines have been taboo except for medicine people seeking visions. Night had fallen fully by the time they finished discussing approach strategies. The desert's transformation was complete, burning heat giving way to penetrating chill, harsh glare replaced by profound darkness, broken only by a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. Nakohe took first watch, climbing to a vantage point among the rocks with silent efficiency. Gideon stretched out beside the dying embers of their small fire, wincing as his injured ribs protested the movement. The medicine woman's treatment had indeed dulled the worst of his pain, but the underlying damage remained, a constant reminder of his failure to protect Eleanor at the celebration. As exhaustion drew him towards sleep, his thoughts returned to her. Not as she had appeared when Bishop dragged her away, frightened and desperate, but as she had been on countless evenings at the homestead. Eleanor reading by lamplight, her face serene in concentration. Eleanor laughing during their target practice, surprised by her own proficiency. Eleanor in the garden, dirt smudged across her cheek as she tended growing things with the same care she'd shown to his wound after the Davidson gang ambush. Eleanor wearing his mother's silver comb. Understanding its significance without requiring explanations, he found difficult to articulate. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, she waited. Perhaps frightened, certainly uncertain, but possessing a core of strength that had impressed even the Apache medicine woman. Tomorrow would bring them closer, one way or another. "Hold on, Eleanor," he murmured into the desert night. "I'm coming." Above him, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow reassuring in their constancy. The same stars shone over Eleanor wherever she was being held in the mission ruins, and would illuminate their path when dawn arrived to guide their continued pursuit into the mountains where Las Aguilas mines awaited. Chapter 8. Eleanor's Captivity. Eleanor's wrists burned where the leather bindings had chafed the skin raw during the long hours on horseback. Bishop had secured her hands before him on the saddle, tight enough to prevent escape, but loose enough to maintain the pretense of gentlemanly consideration. Her back pressed against his chest with each jolt of the horse's gait, a constant reminder of her captivity. They had ridden through the night following the abduction, the Independence Day fireworks fading to distant flickers behind them as Bishop set a punishing pace across the moonlit desert. Her initial shock and terror had gradually given way to a numb resignation as physical discomfort dominated her awareness. Thirst that parched her throat, muscles cramping from the unnatural position, and the relentless forward motion that denied any possibility of rest. Dawn had brought brief respite when Bishop's party stopped to water the horses at a brackish seep, barely worthy of being called a spring. One of Bishop's men had untied her hands long enough for her to drink and attend to personal needs, behind a sparse growth of mesquite, but the momentary freedom had ended all too quickly. Now, as the sun climbed toward noon on the day after her abduction, Eleanor forced herself to focus beyond her physical distress. She studied the landscape they traversed, committing landmarks to memory. An oddly shaped butte to the north, a dry creek bed cutting across their path, distant purple mountains that seemed no closer despite hours of travel toward them. If she survived this ordeal and somehow escaped, such knowledge might prove vital. "You've been remarkably stoic, Miss Price," Bishop observed, breaking a silence that had stretched for miles. "Most Boston ladies of my acquaintance would have succumbed to hysterics long before now." Eleanor didn't respond, unwilling to engage in the pleasant social fiction he maintained alongside the reality of her abduction. Bishop chuckled, seemingly amused rather than offended by her silence. "Come now, a bit of conversation will help pass the miles. Surely you have questions about your situation." When she remained silent, his arm tightened fractionally around her waist. Not enough to cause pain, but a reminder of the power he held over her physical person. "Discourtesy is unnecessary, Miss Price. We could be quite pleasant traveling companions if you'd make the effort." "Very well," Eleanor said, her voice roughened by thirst and exhaustion. "Why did you abduct me? What possible value could I have to you beyond the locket you seem so fixated upon?" "Direct and intelligent, I appreciate both qualities," Bishop replied, his cultured Virginia accent at odds with their harsh surroundings. "The locket itself would be sufficient reason, given its significance. But you, my dear, possess something equally valuable: knowledge of the cipher it contains." "I have no knowledge of any cipher," Eleanor countered. "The markings inside are merely decorative as far as I'm aware. My grandmother never mentioned any special significance." Bishop made a small sound of disappointment. "I had hoped for more honesty between us. Thomas reported in his letters that you were quite familiar with the locket's contents and their meaning." The mention of Thomas Mitchell sent a fresh wave of hurt through Eleanor, though she struggled not to let it show. "Thomas and I never met. Whatever he reported to you was fabrication." "Ah, that's where you're mistaken." Bishop guided his horse around a cluster of barrel cactus. "Thomas may never have met you in person, but he corresponded with you quite extensively. Every letter you sent, with your charming descriptions of the locket's interior markings, your family history, your grandmother's mysterious hints about its importance, came directly to me." Realization dawned, bringing with it a sickening clarity. "You wrote the letters I received. Thomas Mitchell never existed." "Oh, he existed," Bishop corrected. "A useful scout with connections in Boston society who could make discreet inquiries about certain families known to possess heirlooms of interest. But the correspondence that so touched your heart, those thoughtful reflections on literature and philosophy that convinced you to travel west, my compositions entirely." The calculated cruelty of the deception staggered Eleanor. Every hope she'd placed in those letters, every imagined future she'd constructed around the man she believed had written them, all had been elaborate manipulation designed to separate her from her locket. "Why not simply steal it while I was in Boston?" she asked, struggling to understand the convoluted scheme. "Why bring me all the way to Arizona?" Bishop sighed as if explaining something obvious to a child. "Your grandmother's protective measures made direct theft impractical. The locket never left your person during daylight hours, and your home was surprisingly well secured for a family in reduced circumstances. Furthermore, your grandmother had apparently instilled such devotion to the piece that we believed you might have memorized aspects of the cipher not visible to casual inspection." Eleanor thought of her grandmother's deathbed instructions to keep the locket close and never reveal its markings to strangers. Warnings she had attributed to an elderly woman's sentimental attachment rather than genuine concern for its security. How much had her grandmother known that she had never shared? "The markings are incomplete by themselves," Bishop continued, seemingly enjoying the opportunity to explain his scheme now that it had succeeded. "They require context, specific landscape features, astronomical alignments, or companion documents. We hoped your family lore might provide such context." Ahead, one of Bishop's men raised a hand, signaling the group to halt at a small outcropping that provided minimal shade. As they dismounted, Eleanor took the opportunity to study her captors more carefully. Besides Bishop himself, she counted 5 men of varying ages, all bearing the weathered look of those accustomed to frontier hardship. Their interaction suggested military background. They deferred to Bishop with ingrained habit rather than mere respect, using terms like colonel and sir despite their civilian clothing. 2 of the men, an older, grizzled fighter with a pronounced limp, and a younger, dark-haired man with cold eyes, began arguing as they unsaddled the horses. "Ain't right, Hampton taking the southern route," the older man grumbled. "She should have met us at the rendezvous as planned." "Hampton does as the colonel orders," the younger man replied, though his expression suggested similar displeasure. "Maybe he's already at the mines securing our position. Or maybe he's halfway to Mexico with his share," the older man muttered. "Wouldn't be the first time someone got ideas about a bigger cut." Bishop interrupted sharply. "Enough, Jenkins. Hampton knows his duty. You do well to remember yours." The exchange, brief as it was, revealed important information. Dissension within Bishop's ranks, concern about another Confederate named Hampton, and confirmation that mines were indeed their destination. Eleanor filed each detail away, continuing her assessment of the men who held her captive. The youngest among them, a fair-haired man hardly older than herself, approached with a canteen, offering it to Eleanor with a hesitant smile. "You should drink, miss. Desert takes moisture faster than most folks realize." "Thank you," Eleanor said, accepting the canteen and studying him as she drank. Unlike the others, he lacked the hardened demeanor of a veteran fighter. His hands were relatively uncalloused, his manner more educated. "Reynolds, stop coddling the prisoner," snapped the dark-haired man, earning a flush of embarrassment from the young guard. "Just following the colonel's orders to keep her in good condition, Mercer," Reynolds replied, taking back the canteen when Eleanor finished. "Can't use the cipher if she's collapsed from heat exhaustion." Mercer snorted but turned away, leaving Reynolds to secure Eleanor in the shade of the rock outcropping. Rather than the rough handling she'd expected, he eased her to a seated position and checked her bindings with something approaching apology in his expression. "Not too tight?" he asked quietly, loosening the leather strap slightly when he saw the raw skin beneath. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You don't seem like the others." Uncertainty flickered across Reynolds' youthful features. "Colonel Bishop saved my family's plantation after the war. Without him, we'd have lost everything." He glanced toward where Bishop consulted a map with 2 of his men. "What he's doing, it's for the greater cause. The true South will rise again." The fervor in his voice carried the unmistakable tone of indoctrination, belief without personal experience of the war, that had supposedly justified such loyalty. Eleanor recognized an opening. A potential ally, or at least someone less committed to Bishop's methods than the hardened veterans who comprised the rest of the party. Before she could pursue the conversation further, Bishop approached, folding his map with precise movements. "We'll rest here for an hour, then continue to the mission," he announced, settling beside Eleanor with the casual presumption of a man who expected his proximity to be welcomed rather than endured. "To resume our earlier discussion, Miss Price, I do hope you'll consider cooperating fully once we reach our destination. The process of extracting the cipher's full meaning will be much more pleasant for everyone if you share what you know willingly." "I've told you the truth," Eleanor replied evenly. "My grandmother never explained the marking's significance. I viewed them as decorative, nothing more." Bishop studied her face with calculated assessment. "Perhaps. Or perhaps she shared more than you realize." He reached out to touch her cheek with one gloved finger, the gesture carrying proprietary possession rather than affection. "We'll have ample time to explore your memories once we reach the mines." Eleanor turned her face away from his touch, fixing her gaze on the distant mountains that held whatever fate Bishop had planned for her. Behind the fear and exhaustion, anger had begun to burn, not just at her abduction, but at the elaborate deception that had brought her across the continent under false pretenses, at the casual cruelty that viewed her life as merely incidental to the acquisition of her locket. The grief she had felt upon learning of Thomas Mitchell's death transformed in that moment, crystallizing into cold determination. Bishop had orchestrated every step of her journey west, manipulating her choices through lies crafted to appeal to her specific hopes and fears. But he had miscalculated in one crucial aspect. The woman who had left Boston in desperate hope of a new beginning was not the same woman who now sat bound in the Arizona desert. Months with Gideon Kane had taught her self-reliance, observation, and the patient assessment of both danger and opportunity. As Bishop returned to his men, Eleanor began systematically testing her bindings, careful to maintain the appearance of exhausted resignation. Whatever happened at the mines, she would not be the passive victim Bishop expected. She would find a way to escape. Or, at minimum, to ensure that her locket never served whatever mad scheme drove this obsessed Confederate officer still fighting a war that had ended more than a decade earlier. The image of Gideon rising from the ground after Bishop's men had struck him down remained vivid in her mind. The determination in his eyes, the promise conveyed without words. He would come for her. Of that she had no doubt. Her task was to stay alive and alert until he did. Dusk was gathering by the time Bishop's party reached the abandoned Spanish mission. The adobe walls glowed amber in the fading light, their crumbling edges softened by sunset into a melancholy beauty that belied the structure's state of decay. What had once been an outpost of European civilization in a hostile wilderness now stood empty, its bell tower partially collapsed, its chapel open to the sky where the roof had long since fallen. Despite her exhaustion, Eleanor studied the surroundings carefully as they rode into what had once been the mission's central courtyard. The complex was larger than she had expected, a chapel with attendant priests' quarters, outbuildings that might have served as workshops or storage, all arranged around a central plaza dominated by a stone well. Beyond the mission proper, she glimpsed the remains of a small settlement, collapsed stone houses, and the rusted remnants of mining equipment, evidence of the community that had once supported itself through the nearby silver diggings. Bishop's men moved with practiced efficiency to establish camp, two securing the horses, while others gathered firewood and assessed the most defensible buildings. Eleanor noted their patterns, the instinctive military organization that persisted despite years of civilian existence. These were not common outlaws, but trained soldiers still operating according to battlefield discipline. "We'll spend the night here," Bishop informed her as he helped her dismount, his courtesy again at odds with her status as prisoner. "The mines are another half-day's journey, but the approach is treacherous after dark." Eleanor's legs nearly buckled as she found herself on solid ground for the first time in over 12 hours. Bishop steadied her with a firm grip on her arm, then turned to the youngest of his men. "Reynolds, secure Miss Price in the sacristy. It's the most intact structure, and the stone walls will provide relief from the night chill." His tone carried the casual authority of a man long accustomed to unquestioned command. "See that she has water and food. We need her lucid for tomorrow's work." "Yes, sir," Reynolds replied, stepping forward to take Eleanor's arm with considerably more gentleness than his commander had shown. The building to which he guided her had indeed once been the mission's sacristy, a small stone chamber adjacent to the chapel proper, used for storing vestments and sacred vessels. Its heavy wooden door hung askew on one remaining hinge, but the roof remained largely intact, and the thick stone walls promised some protection from the desert's dramatic temperature fluctuations. Inside, a crude pallet of blankets had been arranged in one corner, suggesting the room had been prepared in advance of their arrival. A small lantern cast fitful light across stone walls embellished with faded religious paintings, saints and martyrs watching with solemn eyes as Eleanor was led to her makeshift prison. "I'll bring water and something to eat," Reynolds said, hesitating at the doorway. "The colonel says your hands can be untied while you're in here, since there's only one exit and it'll be guarded." Eleanor nodded gratefully, extending her bound wrists. The leather cutting into raw skin had become almost unbearable during the final hours of their journey. Reynolds produced a small knife and carefully cut the bindings, wincing slightly at the angry red marks they had left. "I'll get something for those abrasions when I return," he promised, avoiding her eyes as if ashamed of his role in causing her discomfort. When he had gone, Eleanor sank onto the pallet, allowing herself a moment of genuine weakness now that she was unobserved. Every muscle ached from the unnatural position she had been forced to maintain during their ride. Her head throbbed with dehydration and hunger. The temptation to surrender to exhaustion pulled at her with nearly irresistible force. Instead, she forced herself to stand, ignoring protesting muscles as she made a careful circuit of her prison. The stone walls offered no hope of escape. Solid masonry constructed to last centuries, with only a small window set high in the eastern wall, too narrow for even a child to squeeze through. The door, despite its damaged condition, would be easily guarded from outside. Her examination complete, Eleanor turned her attention to herself. Her once fine dress, carefully enhanced with calico for the Independence Day celebration, was now torn and filthy from the hard journey. Her hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, Gideon's silver comb miraculously still tangled among the strands. She worked it free, clutching the precious object in her palm like a talisman. The comb's weight in her hand steadied her, a physical reminder of Gideon and the home they had begun to build together. Whatever Bishop intended, whatever dangers awaited her in the mines tomorrow, she would not surrender to despair while this token of Gideon's regard remained in her possession. Reynolds returned shortly with a canteen of fresh water, a tin plate containing beans and salt pork, and a small pot of salve. He set these items on the floor near her pallet, then produced a second blanket from under his arm. "Night gets cold out here," he explained, laying it beside the first. "Stone holds the chill, especially after the sun's been off it for a while." Eleanor studied him more carefully now that they were relatively alone. He couldn't be more than 25, with the fair complexion that burned rather than tanned in the desert sun, and the polished accent of someone raised in genteel circumstances. Unlike Bishop's other men who carried themselves with the hard-edged wariness of those acquainted with violence, Reynolds moved with the slight awkwardness of someone still adjusting to frontier conditions. "You're from Virginia," she observed, detecting the distinctive Tidewater accent beneath his careful diction. Surprise flickered across his features. "Yes, ma'am. Fairfax County, before the war." "You're too young to have fought," Eleanor said, calculating quickly. "You would have been a child when it ended." A flush rose in his cheeks. "I was 12 when Richmond fell." "Old enough to remember what the Yankees—" He caught himself, glancing toward the door as if concerned someone might overhear. "I should check if the colonel needs anything else." "Wait," Eleanor said, sensing his discomfort might work to her advantage. "Please, I don't understand any of this. Why is Bishop so obsessed with my locket? What does he believe it will reveal?" Reynolds hesitated, loyalty to Bishop clearly warring with basic humanitarian impulse, and perhaps a young man's natural desire to impress a woman in distress. "It's not just a locket," he said, finally lowering his voice. "It's a key to something much greater, something that could change everything." "The Confederate treasure Bishop mentioned," Eleanor prompted, careful to show neither too much knowledge nor too little interest. Reynolds nodded, a fervent light entering his eyes. Gold meant to ensure the cause wouldn't die with Richmond's fall. Nearly $2 million in double eagle coins, secreted away by loyal officers when surrender became inevitable. His voice took on the cadence of oft-repeated narrative. Insurance for the future, the colonel calls it. Seed money for a new rising when the time is right. And my locket somehow leads to this gold? Eleanor asked, keeping her tone curious rather than skeptical. The markings inside form part of a cipher, Reynolds explained, warming to his topic. Colonel Bishop has spent years collecting the components. Documents, maps, keys, like your locket. The final piece was discovering someone who might know additional details about the cipher's application. Me, Eleanor said flatly. Except I know nothing about any cipher or hidden gold. A shadow of doubt crossed Reynolds' open features. The colonel believes your grandmother passed on knowledge you might not recognize as significant. Family stories, perhaps, or traditions related to the locket's use. Eleanor shook her head. My grandmother told me only to keep it safe and never show the interior markings to strangers. If she knew more, she took that knowledge to her grave. Before Reynolds could respond, Bishop's voice called from outside. Reynolds, report on the prisoner's condition. Coming, sir. Reynolds replied, gathering himself with visible effort. Try to rest, Miss Price. Tomorrow will be challenging. After he departed, Eleanor forced herself to eat despite her limited appetite, knowing she would need strength for whatever lay ahead. The food was plain but nourishing, and the water eased her parched throat. As full darkness descended outside, voices and occasional laughter drifted through her small window. Bishop's men relaxing around the campfire, sharing a meal and perhaps whiskey from canteens. She had nearly surrendered to exhaustion when the door creaked open again, admitting Bishop himself. The colonel carried a lantern in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other, his expression that of a man about to engage in a pleasant social call rather than the interrogation of a prisoner. I trust Reynolds has made you reasonably comfortable, he said, settling onto a wooden crate that served as the room's only furniture. The accommodations are rudimentary, but we'll have better quarters once we reach the mines tomorrow. Eleanor sat up straighter, determined to show neither fear nor excessive defiance. Either might encourage him in ways she wished to avoid. What do you want, Colonel Bishop? He smiled, apparently pleased by her direct approach. A simple conversation, Miss Price. A civilized exchange of information that might prove beneficial to us both. I've already told you I know nothing about any cipher or treasure, Eleanor said wearily. My grandmother never shared such information with me. Perhaps not directly, Bishop allowed, opening the leather portfolio to reveal several yellowed documents, but indirectly through family stories, traditions, even seemingly insignificant comments about the locket's origins or purpose. Your correspondence with Thomas mentioned several intriguing references. Eleanor flinched internally at the reminder of those letters. Her hopes and confidences spilled onto pages read by this cold-eyed stranger with calculation rather than the empathy she had imagined in her non-existent suitor. Bishop extracted a document from his portfolio, unfolding it carefully to reveal a map drawn on aged parchment. This is a survey of the Las Aguilas silver mines created by a Spanish engineer in 1783, he explained, turning it so Eleanor could see the intricate drawings. Note these symbols along the margins. Despite her reluctance to show interest, Eleanor couldn't help looking where he indicated. Along the map's borders ran a series of markings. Crescents, crosses, stylized animals, and stars, arranged in patterns that did indeed resemble the engravings inside her grandmother's locket. The Spanish used a complex system of markers to indicate mineral deposits, Bishop continued, warming to his lecture like a professor with a particularly promising student. But certain engineers, particularly those with connections to Masonic lodges or other secret societies, embedded additional information in their surveys. Information about secondary discoveries deemed too valuable for ordinary documentation. Gold, Eleanor said, understanding dawning. They found gold but kept it secret. Bishop nodded, pleased by her quick grasp. Precisely. Spanish colonial administration demanded a royal fifth of all precious metals discovered in New Spain. But gold found in conjunction with silver mining operations could be concealed, reserved for private interests or extraordinary circumstances. He extracted another document, a letter written in faded brown ink, the script flowing and archaic. This correspondence between the engineer and his superiors in Mexico City contains oblique references to additional security measures taken regarding materials of unusual purity, coded language for a substantial gold discovery. Despite her situation, Eleanor found herself intrigued by the historical narrative Bishop was constructing. But what does this have to do with Confederate gold? The Spanish abandoned these mines decades before the Civil War. An astute question, Bishop acknowledged, returning the documents to his portfolio. The connection is one of opportunity rather than direct lineage. When our treasury shipments needed hiding in the war's final days, one of the officers tasked with their security had extensive knowledge of these territories from the Mexican War. He recalled stories of the abandoned Spanish mines and their rumored hidden wealth. Bishop leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. Imagine the elegance of it. Secreting new treasure in a location already designed to conceal old treasure, using existing hiding places enhanced with modern security measures. The perfect marriage of historical precedent and contemporary necessity. "And my locket?" Eleanor asked, though she could now guess the answer. "Belonged originally to the Spanish engineer's wife," Bishop confirmed. "A family heirloom passed through her descendants, eventually crossing the Atlantic with emigrants to the new American nation. Your mother's family." The revelation struck Eleanor with unexpected force. Her grandmother's cryptic statements about the locket's importance, her insistence that Eleanor keep it close and protected, all took on new meaning in light of Bishop's explanation. "The officer who hid the Confederate shipments discovered your family's connection to the original engineer," Bishop continued. "He created a new cipher based on the locket's markings, one that would reveal the exact location within the mines where our gold is secreted, a location known only to 3 men, all now deceased. Except for the documentation they left behind." "Documentation you've spent years collecting," Eleanor said, pieces falling into place. "Along with other loyal sons of the South," Bishop agreed, a satisfied smile playing across his features. "Tomorrow, that collection will be complete when we reach the mines and apply your locket's key to the cipher's final resolution." "And then?" Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Bishop rose, gathering his portfolio with the careful movements of a man accustomed to handling precious objects. "Then a new chapter begins, Miss Price. The true Confederacy rises from dormancy, funded adequately to restore its rightful place in this nation's governance." His expression hardened slightly. "Those who assist willingly in this grand endeavor will be remembered favorably in the histories yet to be written." The implicit threat needed no elaboration. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the chill that ran through her at his words. "History is written by victors, Colonel," she said quietly, "and the Confederacy has already lost once." Something dangerous flashed in Bishop's eyes, a glimpse of the ruthlessness that had earned him his fearsome wartime reputation. Then his aristocratic mask slipped back into place, the momentary break sealed as if it had never occurred. "Rest well, Miss Price," he said pleasantly. "We depart at first light for the final stage of our journey. I do hope you'll reconsider your position by then. Cooperation would make tomorrow's events so much more agreeable for everyone concerned." After he left, securing the damaged door as best he could, Eleanor sat motionless on her pallet, mind racing despite her physical exhaustion. Bishop's historical narrative explained much: her grandmother's protective secrecy, Mitchell's focused interest in her family background, the seeming coincidence that had brought her west at precisely the moment Bishop was assembling his final pieces. But knowledge, while useful, did not provide immediate means of escape. The mission was well guarded, the surrounding desert hostile to anyone attempting flight without proper supplies and direction. Her best hope remained Gideon. But would he find her trail in time? And even if he did, could one man, however skilled, overcome Bishop's well-organized force? Eleanor clutched Gideon's silver comb, running her fingers over its familiar contours as if the object might somehow communicate with its giver. Tomorrow would bring either opportunity or further danger, perhaps both. She must be ready to recognize and seize any chance for escape, however slim. As she finally surrendered to sleep, her dreams filled with images of crescent markings, hidden gold, and Gideon riding through the desert with the relentless determination she had come to associate with the bounty hunter who had unexpectedly claimed her heart. The morning sun beat mercilessly against the stone walls of the abandoned mission, turning Eleanor's small prison into an oven by mid-morning. She had awoken to Reynolds bringing a tin cup of bitter coffee and a piece of hardtack. Poor fare that nonetheless helped clear her mind after fitful sleep. The young guard had barely spoken, his expression troubled as he'd secured her wrists once more, though with a strip of cloth beneath the leather to protect her raw skin. Now she sat at a rough wooden table that Bishop's men had dragged into the old chapel, the only space large enough to accommodate the collection of maps, documents, and surveying instruments the colonel had spread before her. Sunlight streamed through the roofless structure, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the heated air. Across the table, Bishop arranged his materials with the meticulous precision of a scholar. His coat had been discarded in deference to the heat, his shirt sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow, the very picture of a gentleman at work on an intellectual puzzle, rather than an obsessed former officer holding a woman captive for her unwilling assistance. "Now then, Miss Price," he said, placing her grandmother's locket in the center of the table, "let us approach this systematically. The markings inside your locket correspond to specific locations on this survey map of the Los Aguilas mine complex. What we require is your insight into how precisely they align." Eleanor stared at the locket, now removed from its chain and opened to display the mysterious engravings that had been a familiar but meaningless part of her life until now. Beside it lay the aged Spanish map she had glimpsed the previous evening, its edges weighted with small stones to prevent the parchment from curling in the dry air. "I've told you repeatedly," she said, striving to keep her tone even rather than confrontational. "I have no special knowledge about these markings. My grandmother never explained their significance." Bishop's smile remained fixed, though something hardened in his eyes. "Yet in your correspondence with Thomas, you mentioned family stories about the locket serving as a guide or key. You described your grandmother's habit of opening it at specific times of year and aligning it with the sunset. Curious behavior for a merely decorative object, wouldn't you agree?" Eleanor silently cursed her own loose tongue in those letters, her eagerness to share family history with the phantom suitor who had seemed so interested in her heritage. "Grandmother was superstitious about many things," she said carefully. "The locket was precious to her, but she never explained why beyond its sentimental value." "Convenient," Bishop remarked, the single word carrying dangerous undercurrents. "Reynolds, bring Miss Price some water. The heat affects clear thinking, and we need her mind sharp." While Reynolds fetched water, Bishop aligned the locket with various markings on the map, muttering calculations and occasional notes in a small leather journal. Eleanor observed his process carefully, noting which combinations seemed to satisfy him and which triggered frustration. Though she truly had no special knowledge of the cipher, she recognized that appearing wholly ignorant might prove more dangerous than feigning confused cooperation. When Reynolds returned with the water, she drank gratefully, using the moment to gather her thoughts. Gideon had once described to her how he approached tracking, not pursuing, a linear path, but building a complete picture of his quarry through careful observation of patterns, habits, and environmental responses. She needed similar patience now, accumulating information while giving away as little as possible. "This crescent marking," she ventured, pointing to one of the symbols inside the locket, "reminds me of how my grandmother would sometimes hold the locket up to the night sky. I always assumed she was being fanciful, but perhaps she was aligning it with the moon's phase?" Bishop's attention sharpened immediately, exactly as she had anticipated. "At what time of year did she do this? On specific dates or during particular lunar phases?" Eleanor furrowed her brow as if struggling to recall distant memories. "I believe it was during the autumn equinox, but I couldn't say with certainty. She was quite secretive about such rituals. The fabricated detail had the desired effect." Bishop bent over the map with renewed energy, aligning the locket differently and making rapid calculations in his journal. Eleanor had bought herself precious minutes with the simple lie, and perhaps sown confusion that would further delay his progress. As morning stretched toward noon, she continued this strategy, offering vague recollections that sent Bishop down new paths of investigation, then expressing bewilderment when they yielded no results. She could feel his patience wearing thin with each fruitless computation, yet her apparent willingness to help prevented him from resorting to harsher methods of persuasion. The other men drifted in and out of the chapel during this process. Jenkins, the older veteran with the pronounced limp, watched the proceedings with evident skepticism, occasionally exchanging loaded glances with Mercer, the dark-haired man who had reprimanded Reynolds for showing Eleanor kindness. The tension between them and Bishop grew palpable as hours passed without breakthrough. "Colonel," Jenkins finally said during a brief lull, "we're burning daylight. Hampton and his boys could be setting up at the mines already, maybe even finding the cache without us." Bishop didn't look up from his calculations. Hampton knows better than to proceed without the cipher key. His instructions were explicit. "Same as his instructions to meet us here?" Mercer interjected, his tone just short of insubordination. "Yet he's nowhere to be found." "Perhaps something delayed him," Bishop replied with dangerous calm. "Or perhaps he's simply following protocol and waiting at the secondary rendezvous point." Eleanor observed this exchange with careful attention, noting the undercurrents of distrust flowing beneath the surface loyalty. Here was potential leverage. Division within Bishop's ranks that might be exploited if properly nurtured. "It seems strange," she said with deliberate innocence, "that your associate would be granted separate instructions about something as valuable as Confederate Treasury gold. In my experience, men rarely share valuable secrets more widely than absolutely necessary." Jenkins' head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing with sudden suspicion. "What's that supposed to mean, Mrs.?" Bishop shot her a sharp glance that conveyed he understood exactly what she was attempting. "Miss Price is merely making conversation to distract from her own reluctance to share what she knows, an understandable but ultimately futile strategy." He turned back to his men, authority hardening his voice. "Hampton has his role, as each of you has yours. Questions about the distribution of information or resources serve no purpose except to waste time we cannot afford." The rebuke silenced further commentary, but Eleanor had seen enough to confirm her assessment. Bishop maintained control through a combination of military authority, shared ideology, and promised reward, but beneath that control lurked uncertainty about his ultimate intentions regarding the treasure. The men followed him in part because they believed they would share in the gold's discovery. If that belief were undermined, as afternoon heat reached its peak, Bishop's frustration finally boiled over. He slammed his hand down on the table, causing maps to jump and dust to rise from the weathered wood. "Enough prevarication," he snapped, facade of gentlemanly scholarship cracking under pressure. "You know more than you're admitting, Miss Price. Your grandmother would not have entrusted such a valuable item to you without proper instruction in its use." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch despite the barely contained violence in his tone. "My grandmother died suddenly, Colonel. Whatever instructions she might have intended to provide died with her. I've told you everything I can recall about the locket's history." Bishop leaned across the table, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "I've been exceedingly patient with you, out of respect for your sex and upbringing. That patience has limits." His voice lowered, intended for her ears alone. "There are methods of encouraging cooperation that leave no visible marks but prove remarkably effective. I would prefer not to employ them, but make no mistake, I will have what I need from you one way or another." The threat hung in the air between them, all pretense of civilized interaction stripped away. Eleanor felt cold fear slide down her spine despite the oppressive heat, yet maintained her outward composure through sheer force of will. "Threatening me won't create knowledge I don't possess," she said quietly. "But I'm willing to continue examining the markings if you believe it helpful. Perhaps with more time, I'll recall something useful." Bishop studied her face, searching for deception. Whatever he saw there, genuine ignorance or well-concealed defiance, caused him to straighten and reassume his mask of controlled civility. "Very well, we'll resume this discussion tomorrow at the mines themselves. Perhaps proximity to the actual location will jog your memory more effectively." He gathered his documents with sharp, angry movements. "Reynolds, secure the prisoner in the sacristy until departure. No one speaks with her without my express permission." As Reynolds led her back to her stone cell, Eleanor caught another exchanged glance between Jenkins and Mercer. Speculative, calculating, with an edge of something that might have been decision rather than mere discontent. She had planted seeds of doubt. Now she could only hope they would take root before Bishop forced a breakthrough with the cipher or resorted to the methods he had threatened. The door closed behind her with finality, the damaged hinges groaning in protest. Through the small window, she could see Bishop striding toward the mission's perimeter, journal clutched in one hand, the set of his shoulders betraying tension that belied his controlled demeanor. She had bought herself another day through clever misdirection, but tomorrow would bring new challenges at the mines themselves. Eleanor sank onto her pallet, mind racing despite physical exhaustion. Bishop struck her as a man balanced on the knife edge of obsession. Rational enough to maintain control of his men and methodical in his approach to the cipher, yet driven by a fervor that bordered on madness when it came to the Confederate gold itself. Such men were unpredictable when thwarted, and she had deliberately thwarted him throughout the day's exercises. She touched her grandmother's locket, which Bishop had carelessly left in her possession after their frustrating session. The familiar weight of it in her palm provided small comfort in her confinement. Whatever secrets it truly held, and she remained convinced her grandmother had known more than she'd shared, Eleanor hoped they would continue to elude Bishop long enough for Gideon to find her. If not, she would need to create her own opportunity for escape, using whatever tools came to hand, including the growing discord among Bishop's increasingly impatient men. Night had fallen over the mission, bringing welcome relief from the day's oppressive heat. Through her small window, Eleanor could see stars emerging in the clear desert sky, brilliant and numerous beyond anything visible in Boston's smoke-hazed atmosphere. A sliver of moon hung low on the horizon, a crescent shape reminiscent of her birthmark and the symbols within her locket. She had dozed fitfully for several hours, conserving strength while remaining alert to any changes in the patterns of sound from the camp outside. Bishop's men maintained regular watch rotations, their footsteps passing her door at predictable intervals. From these sounds and occasional fragments of conversation, she had pieced together their guard schedule and identified which man held each shift. The scrape of boots outside her door roused her fully. A brief knock followed an unexpected courtesy that identified the visitor before the door swung open to reveal Reynolds, a lantern held low to minimize visible light. "Miss Price," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Are you awake?" Eleanor sat up, instantly alert. "Yes, what time is it?" "Just past midnight. The colonel and others are asleep." Reynolds stepped inside, closing the door partially behind him. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about your grandmother's rituals with the locket, the alignment with moon phases." Eleanor tensed, uncertain whether this represented threat or opportunity. She had fabricated those details to mislead Bishop. Had Reynolds seen through her deception? "I believe there might be something to it," he continued earnestly. "The Spanish often incorporated celestial alignments into their mining operations, shafts positioned to catch sunlight on specific dates, markers that were only visible during particular moon phases." "That's fascinating," Eleanor said carefully, watching his expression for any sign of Bishop's influence behind this midnight visit. Reynolds glanced toward the door again, then lowered his voice further. "I've studied these mines extensively, part of my value to the colonel's operation. There's a particular tunnel entrance that corresponds with markings like those in your locket. It's oriented toward the rising of certain stars that would have been significant to both Spanish engineers and the local Apache." "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked directly, suspicion warring with hope that this might represent genuine assistance. Reynolds' youthful features showed genuine conflict. "The colonel is growing impatient. Tomorrow at the mines, I fear his methods may become more forceful than you've yet experienced." He swallowed hard. "I joined this endeavor believing in its noble purpose, restoring the South's rightful place through legitimate means, not through—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to articulate what he feared Bishop might do. Eleanor recognized the opening she had been hoping for, a crack in the loyalty of Bishop's youngest and most idealistic follower. "You believe examining this tunnel might help me recall something useful, Something that would satisfy the colonel without resorting to these methods, you fear? Exactly. Reynolds nodded eagerly. The entrance isn't far, just beyond the mission walls at the base of the foothills. We could examine it now while the others sleep, and perhaps discover something that would make tomorrow's journey unnecessary. The proposition carried obvious risks. This could be a trap set by Bishop to test her willingness to escape, or Reynolds might have motives beyond those he'd expressed. Yet, remaining passive guaranteed nothing except continued captivity and eventual arrival at the mines, where Bishop's patience would likely expire entirely. Very well, Eleanor agreed, rising from her pallet. But I'll need water before we go. The day's heat has left me parched. Reynolds produced a canteen from beneath his coat. Already thought of that. I've brought water and a little food. It's about half an hour's walk to the tunnel entrance. He helped her to her feet with the same gentle courtesy he'd shown previously, then hesitated. I should bind your wrists for appearance's sake until we're beyond the guard's sight. Jenkins has watch at the perimeter, but he's been drinking and should be easy enough to avoid. Eleanor extended her wrists, mind racing ahead to calculate possibilities for escape once outside the mission walls. The risk of fleeing immediately into the desert seemed greater than continuing with Reynolds to the tunnel. She had no supplies, no clear direction, and Bishop's men would easily track her in the morning light. Better to learn what she could from this excursion, perhaps discovering something that might be leveraged for a more viable escape later. With her wrists loosely bound before her, Eleanor followed Reynolds through the damaged door and across the mission's courtyard, keeping to shadows and stopping frequently to ensure they remained undetected. The bright starlight provided sufficient illumination for navigation once her eyes adjusted, making Reynolds' covered lantern necessary only for the darkest corners. They reached the mission's crumbling perimeter wall without incident, slipping through a collapsed section rather than approaching the main entrance, where Jenkins presumably stood guard. Once beyond the wall, Reynolds removed her bindings and oriented himself, using the stars above. This way, he whispered, pointing toward the foothills that rose dark against the night sky. Stay close. The ground is uneven, and there are abandoned prospecting pits that can be treacherous in the dark. The walk took somewhat longer than the half-hour Reynolds had estimated, their progress necessarily slow across unfamiliar terrain in limited light. Eleanor used the time to study their surroundings, committing landmarks to memory while considering and discarding various escape scenarios. Without a horse, supplies, or clear knowledge of the territory, her chances remained poor unless she could somehow turn Reynolds fully against Bishop or secure his direct assistance. There, Reynolds said finally, pointing toward a dark opening in the hillside barely visible against the surrounding rock. That's the tunnel entrance I mentioned. As they approached, Eleanor could see that this was indeed no natural cave, but a worked mine entrance, its frame reinforced with ancient timbers that had weathered to silver gray in the desert air. The opening itself was surprisingly small, perhaps 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, requiring an adult to duck and turn sideways to enter. Reynolds uncovered his lantern, its yellow light spilling across the weathered stone. The Spanish engineers who designed these mines were remarkably sophisticated for their time. They incorporated natural features into their work whenever possible. Following existing fissures in the rock rather than forcing new pathways, he ducked through the entrance, holding the lantern high to illuminate the space beyond. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor followed, bending low to clear the timber lintel. Inside, the tunnel opened slightly, allowing them to stand upright, though with little room to spare. The air was noticeably cooler than outside, carrying the mineral scent of earth long hidden from sunlight. Reynolds raised the lantern, revealing rough-hewn walls that bore the marks of ancient tools and occasional support beams of age-darkened wood. This particular tunnel doesn't extend far, he explained, moving forward carefully. It was an exploratory shaft that proved unproductive for silver, so they abandoned it early in the operation. But what makes it interesting? He paused, turning the lantern toward the wall on their right, illuminating what at first appeared to be natural discolorations in the stone. As Eleanor looked more closely, however, she realized she was seeing artwork. Images painted or etched into the rock's surface centuries earlier. Petroglyphs, Reynolds said, his voice hushed with scholarly reverence. Not Spanish, but Apache. created long before European arrival. The Spanish miners discovered them when excavating this tunnel and preserved them out of superstition or perhaps genuine respect. Eleanor moved closer, studying the ancient images with growing fascination and unease. The pictures formed a clear narrative sequence, stylized human figures surrounding what appeared to be a mountain or perhaps the mine itself. At the center stood a distinctive figure, taller than the others, with a crescent shape prominently displayed on what might have been its arm or wrist. "The marked woman," she whispered, her finger hovering just above the surface without touching the fragile artwork. Reynolds nodded, his expression solemn in the lantern light. The local Apache have legends about these images, stories passed down through generations. They say they foretell a time when strangers would come seeking treasure hidden within the mountain, led by a woman bearing the night's smile upon her skin. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she continued studying the pictographs, following the narrative as it progressed across the wall. The next grouping showed the marked woman and the treasure seekers entering the mountain, represented by a series of angular lines that suggested tunnels or passages. The final scene depicted unmistakable destruction, figures lying prone while the mountain itself seemed to collapse upon them. "It's a warning," she said softly, the realization chilling her despite the tunnel's cool air. "The prophecy doesn't end well for those seeking treasure." Reynolds swallowed audibly, the lantern trembling slightly in his hand. The colonel dismisses such stories as native superstition, useful only for controlling the uneducated. But there have been incidents, collapses in the deeper tunnels over the years, men lost in spaces that should have been stable. Eleanor turned to face him directly, recognizing the fear beneath his scholarly interest. "You believe these warnings have merit?" It wasn't a question, but Reynolds nodded anyway, the movement casting strange shadows across his youthful features. "My grandfather respected the old ways, the signs and portents that educated men too often dismiss. He said wisdom doesn't always arrive in forms we're trained to recognize." Eleanor's mind raced, sensing opportunity in his evident concern. She gestured toward the petroglyph of the marked woman. "This figure with the crescent marking? It's not just similar to my birthmark. It's identical." She pushed up her sleeve, exposing the pale crescent on her inner wrist, holding it near the etched figure for comparison. The Apache medicine woman recognized it immediately in town. She knew the prophecy. Reynolds stared at her birthmark, then back at the ancient image, his expression shifting from scholarly interest to superstitious dread. "The colonel never mentioned this specific detail. He said only that your family had connection to the Spanish engineer through your locket. He likely deemed it irrelevant," Eleanor said carefully, watching his reaction. "Just as he dismisses these warnings as native superstition. But consider the possibility, Mr. Reynolds. What if these images represent truth? What if Bishop is leading you all into danger foretold centuries ago?" The young man's breathing had quickened, his eyes moving anxiously between her birthmark and the depicted destruction in the final scene. "The colonel has spent years planning this recovery. He's accounted for all practical dangers, structural weaknesses, potential ambushes, competing interests, but not prophecy," Eleanor pressed, seizing the moment. "Not warnings preserved by people who knew these mountains intimately for generations before Europeans arrived. The Apache medicine woman told me the marked woman would bring ruin to those with greed in their hearts." She took a calculated risk, placing her hand gently on Reynolds' arm. "Ask yourself honestly, is Bishop's interest in this gold truly about restoring the South, or has it become personal obsession? Is he driven by noble purpose or consuming greed?" The question struck its intended target. Doubt flickered openly across Reynolds' face, the conflicted loyalty she had sensed earlier now fully exposed in the lantern light. She had correctly assessed him. A young man raised on romantic notions of the lost cause, seeking purpose in a post-war world that had moved on without him, drawn to Bishop's vision of restored Southern glory but troubled by the methods employed to achieve it. "Hampton hasn't arrived as scheduled," he said finally, voicing the concern she had earlier expressed. "That's unprecedented. He's never failed to meet a rendezvous before." "Perhaps he discovered something that changed his assessment of the situation," Eleanor suggested. "Or perhaps something prevented his arrival altogether." Reynolds ran a hand through his hair, his internal conflict evident in the gesture. What are you suggesting, Miss Price? That I should abandon the Colonel's mission based on ancient paintings and coincidental birthmarks? I'm suggesting you keep your eyes open to signs of danger, Eleanor replied, careful not to push too hard too quickly. If we enter the main mine complex tomorrow and you begin observing events that align with these warnings, tunnel instabilities, unusual phenomena, conflicts among the men, consider whether continuing serves the noble purpose you believed in or merely feeds one man's dangerous obsession. She paused, then added with deliberate softness, and perhaps consider whether you might have obligations beyond loyalty to Colonel Bishop, obligations to prevent harm rather than enable it. The implications hung in the air between them, neither spoken explicitly nor easily dismissed. Reynolds turned away, raising the lantern to examine the final scenes of the petroglyph sequence once more. The collapse, the prone figures, the mountain seeming to consume those who had dared violate its secrets. We should return before our absence is discovered, he said finally, his voice strained. The colonel rises early, and the men will begin breaking camp at first light. As they made their way back through the dark tunnel toward the entrance, Reynolds paused once more, turning to face Eleanor with an expression that had transformed from scholarly interest to troubled certainty. If what you suggest proves true, if signs appear that match these warnings, I won't stand by while men are led to destruction, he said quietly. Even the colonel's men deserve better than that. It wasn't quite a promise of assistance, but it represented a significant shift in allegiance, perhaps enough to create opportunity when they reached the mines tomorrow. Eleanor nodded, understanding the courage such a statement required from someone raised in the rigid hierarchy of Southern military tradition. Thank you for showing me this place, she said simply. Whatever happens tomorrow, I believe knowledge serves truth better than ignorance, even uncomfortable knowledge. They emerged from the tunnel into the star-filled night, the crescent moon now higher in the sky, its shape an echo of the marking on Eleanor's wrist and the ancient warning etched in stone behind them. As Reynolds reluctantly rebound her wrists for their return journey to the mission, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of genuine hope since her abduction. Bishop's obsession had created fault lines among his followers, cracks that might be widened with properly applied pressure. Reynolds had moved from loyal follower to potential ally, and tomorrow at the mines would bring opportunities to exploit that shift. She thought of Gideon, imagining him somewhere in the vast darkness surrounding them, tracking relentlessly toward her despite injuries and overwhelming odds. The image strengthened her resolve. She would not be merely a victim awaiting rescue, but an active participant in her own salvation, creating opportunities, sowing discord, and preparing for the moment when chance or planning presented a path to freedom. The mission's walls came into view, stark shadows against the starlit landscape. Within those walls waited Bishop and his men, unaware that ancient warnings and modern doubts had begun to align against them, just as the crescent on Eleanor's wrist aligned with its counterpart in petroglyphs centuries old, a convergence that suggested forces beyond mere coincidence at work in the desert night. Chapter 9. Convergence. Sweat trickled down Gideon's spine as he and Nahio crouched among the scrubby juniper dotting the ridgeline above Las Aguilas. 3 days of hard riding and careful tracking had led them to this vantage point, overlooking the abandoned mining settlement, a collection of weathered stone buildings clustered at the base of a steep mountainside. The June sun beat mercilessly upon the barren landscape, baking the rocky soil and shimmering off exposed metal from long-abandoned mining equipment. Through his field glass, Gideon methodically studied the activity below. Bishop had arrived with his party the previous day, according to the signs they'd found at the deserted mission. The tracks had led directly to this isolated settlement, once home to hundreds of miners, but now a ghost town haunted only by wind and memories. 6 men total, Gideon murmured, counting carefully. Bishop, the older man with the limp, 3 others patrolling the perimeter, one staying close to that stone building on the eastern edge. Nakohe nodded, his keen eyes needing no magnification to track movement below. That one guards something valuable, or someone. As if in confirmation of his assessment, the door to the stone building opened. Gideon's breath caught as a figure in a torn blue dress emerged, flanked by the guard and Bishop himself. Though distance prevented him from seeing her face clearly, he would have recognized Eleanor's posture and movements anywhere. The squared shoulders and lifted chin that spoke of dignity maintained despite desperate circumstances. "Eleanor," he whispered, the name a prayer and promise combined. She appeared physically unharmed, walking without assistance, though, with the careful movements of someone conserving strength. Bishop guided her toward the largest building in the settlement, likely the former assay office, judging by its prominent position and sturdy construction. The guard followed close behind, rifle held casually but ready. Gideon's hands tightened on the field glass until his knuckles whitened. Every instinct demanded immediate action, to charge down the slope, weapons drawn, and reclaim what had been taken. Only hard-won discipline and the certainty of failure kept him motionless, observing and calculating rather than reacting. "You recognize her walk?" Nahue commented. Not a question, but an observation. "The connection between you is strong." Gideon lowered the field glass, turning to study his Apache companion. "Strong enough that I won't risk her life with hasty action. We need more information. Patrol patterns, where they're keeping her, how many men are armed at any given time." Nako's expression remained impassive, but something like approval flickered in his dark eyes. "Patience honors your bond more than reckless courage." He gestured toward the settlement, his movement encompassing the entire site. "This place is known to my people. The Spanish called it Las Aguilas, the eagles, for the birds that nested on the mountain heights. We call it Siahanadli, the mountain that swallows men." The ominous name sent a chill through Gideon, despite the day's heat. "Because of the mine collapses? The Great One, many generations ago," Nahohe confirmed. "Earth shook. Tunnels fell. Many died. Spanish masters and Apache slaves alike, but smaller ones since then. 3 years past, white prospectors tried to reopen the western shaft. 5 entered, 2 returned, babbling of voices in the deep places and walls that moved without hands touching them. Under normal circumstances, Gideon might have dismissed such accounts as frontier superstition. But his years in the territory had taught him respect for knowledge that came through pathways different from his own. The Apache understood this land and its dangers in ways that went beyond practical observation. "Your people believe the mountain itself is dangerous?" he asked, scanning the settlement again for any change in the men's patterns. Nako's gaze turned toward the stark mountainside rising behind the settlement, its face scarred by mine entrances like dark wounds in the pale rock. "We believe the mountain remembers what was done here. Blood spilled, bones broken, spirits trapped in darkness. It does not forget. It does not forgive." He turned back to Gideon, his expression grave. "Most of all, it hates the greedy, those who come seeking only to take, to possess what is not meant for them. These are the ones the mountain hungers for." "Bishop fits that description perfectly," Gideon observed, watching the colonel emerge from the assay office without Ellen. "His obsession with this Confederate gold goes beyond practical value. It's become his entire purpose." "Such men are already half consumed before they enter the tunnels," Nakohe agreed. "Their souls swallowed while their bodies still walk under the sun." They lapsed into silence, continuing their observation as afternoon stretched toward evening. Gideon noted patrol rotations, identified which men carried rifles versus sidearms, and marked the building where Eleanor was being held. A plan began taking shape in his mind, not the direct assault his heart demanded, but a careful infiltration that might succeed where brute force would certainly fail. As shadows lengthened across the valley, Bishop's men gathered near a fire pit in what had once been the settlement's central plaza. All except the youngest, the fair-haired man Gideon had observed guarding Eleanor earlier, who carried food and water into her stone prison before taking up position outside its door. "Tonight," Gideon said finally, "I'll go in after dark, when they've settled for the night. Basic reconnaissance, only locate Eleanor, assess security, find potential escape routes." Nakaho frowned slightly. "The tunnels are treacherous even in daylight. At night, with unfamiliar paths, I won't enter the mine itself," Gideon assured him. "Just the settlement. The mine exploration can wait until we understand the situation better." The Apache studied him silently for a long moment, then nodded once. "I will wait here. Keep watch. If trouble comes, 3 owl calls in succession will warn you. Gideon extended his hand. Thank you, not just for the warning, but for coming this far. Most men wouldn't have. Nakoe clasped his forearm in the warrior's grip. Grandmother saw our paths crossing for a purpose. I honor her vision. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Besides, the marked woman should not be left to men like Bishop. She is a different path to walk. As darkness settled over the mining settlement, Gideon checked his weapons one final time. Knife secured at his belt, revolver loaded with fresh cartridges, derringer tucked into his boot as last resort. The pain in his ribs had subsided to a dull ache thanks to the medicine woman's treatment, and the wound at his temple had begun to heal, the stitches pulling only when he frowned. Nakohe helped him blacken his face with a mixture of ash and bear grease, an Apache hunting technique that would break up the outline of his features in the darkness. The pungent smell was a small price to pay for the advantage it would provide. Remember what I showed you about moving silently? Nakohe instructed. Heel then toe, weight balanced, pause between steps to listen. The night has its own language. Learn to speak it, and darkness becomes your ally. Gideon nodded, appreciating both the practical advice and the philosophy behind it. In the few days they had traveled together, he had gained profound respect for the young Apache's wisdom and skills. Nakoye approached the world with a blend of practical observation and spiritual awareness that transcended the rigid categories of white society's thinking. If I'm not back by first light, go for help, Gideon said, checking the moon's position. The crescent provided just enough illumination to navigate without betraying his presence. Don't try to rescue me alone. Nakake's expression suggested he might disregard this instruction, but he nodded agreement nonetheless. May the mountain favor your purpose, he said formally. It knows the difference between those who take and those who protect. With that blessing, for that's what it felt like, despite Gideon's usual pragmatism, he began his descent toward the settlement, using natural cover and shadow to mask his approach. Years of tracking dangerous men had taught him patience and precision. Now he applied those skills not to pursuit, but to rescue. His determination sharpened by personal stakes that far exceeded any bounty he had ever hunted. Eleanor was down there, alone among enemies. Whatever it took, he would bring her home. Darkness wrapped around Gideon like a familiar cloak as he moved between abandoned buildings at the settlement's edge. The moon had slipped behind clouds, reducing visibility but providing welcome cover for his infiltration. He paused in the shadow of a collapsed lumber shed, listening intently to the night sounds around him. Voices drifted from the central plaza, where Bishop's men had established their main camp. A lantern burned in the makeshift guard post near the assay office, its glow spilling across packed earth that had once bustled with miners and merchants. Now the settlement stood mostly in darkness, its empty buildings like sentinels watching his progress with hollow eyes. Gideon worked his way methodically inward, staying low and using each structure for cover before advancing to the next. His goal was Eleanor's prison, the stone building at the eastern edge that had likely served as a storehouse or powder magazine during the mine's operation. But first, he needed to understand Bishop's full defensive arrangements and, if possible, the man's immediate plans. The murmur of voices grew louder as he approached the assay office. A window at the building's rear stood partially open, likely to admit whatever meager breeze might stir in the stifling night air. Gideon edged closer, pressing his back against the rough stone wall as he positioned himself beneath the window. "Running out of patience, Colonel." The speaker's voice carried the hard edge of frustration poorly concealed. 3 days since we left Redemption and we're no closer to the gold than when we started. Patience, Mercer. Bishop's cultured tones were unmistakable, his Virginia accent more pronounced in private conversation than during his public performances. Miss Price is being deliberately obstructive, but she'll cooperate eventually. No one endures discomfort indefinitely. Gideon's hands clenched involuntarily at the implied threat, but he forced himself to remain motionless, gathering information that might prove vital to Eleanor's rescue. And if she truly doesn't know anything? This was a different voice, older, rough with years of hard living. What if this whole cipher business is just a wild goose chase? Wouldn't be the first time treasure stories turned out to be more story than treasure. The cipher is real, Jenkins. Bishop's voice hardened with absolute conviction. The documentation is extensive and cross-verified. Confederate Treasury gold worth nearly $2 million, hidden specifically to fund continued resistance after conventional warfare became untenable. A bitter laugh. Conventional warfare's been untenable for 11 years, Colonel. War's over, in case you hadn't noticed. The war is merely dormant, Bishop replied, the fervor in his tone bordering on fanaticism. With sufficient resources properly applied, the true Confederacy can rise again. Not as a separate nation, perhaps, but as a powerful force within the corrupted Union, reclaiming our rightful influence. That what Hampton thinks too? 'Cause he's still not here, and that don't sit right with me, the older man's voice, Jenkins, Gideon presumed, carried deep suspicion. Man should have been at the rendezvous 2 days ago. A chair scraped across wooden floorboards. Hampton follows orders, as do all my men. If he hasn't arrived, there's good reason. Or maybe he got to thinking the same thing I am, Jenkins pressed. That $2 million in gold split fewer ways adds up to a considerably larger share. Silence fell, heavy with implied threat. When Bishop spoke again, his voice had gone dangerously quiet. I'd consider very carefully before continuing that line of speculation, Jenkins. Men who question the division of resources often find themselves removed from the calculation entirely. The warning hung in the air, answered only by tense silence. Gideon processed this exchange, filing away the evident friction between Bishop and his men, the absent Confederate named Hampton, and the confirmation of the treasure's supposed value. $2 million in gold would tempt even the most loyal follower to consider alternatives to shared reward. We'll proceed with the main tunnel exploration at first light, Bishop continued, his tone returning to its customary authority. The girl's locket markings align with the Spanish survey map in ways that narrow our search area considerably. The primary ventilation shaft in the 3rd level seems most promising. That shaft's not been properly shored up in 50 years, Jenkins objected. Whole section could come down on our heads. Reynolds will conduct a preliminary safety assessment. His engineering training may be incomplete, but it's sufficient for basic structural evaluation. Papers rustled, suggesting Bishop was consulting maps or documents. I want all men ready to move at dawn, full equipment, including blasting powder if needed. And the girl? Mercer asked. We bringing her into the tunnels? Of course. Her cooperation may prove more forthcoming when she's experiencing the discomfort of the mine environment directly. Fear has a remarkable way of improving memory. Gideon had heard enough. Bishop intended to force Eleanor into potentially unstable mine tunnels at dawn, using fear and discomfort to extract whatever knowledge he believed she possessed. Time for reconnaissance was shorter than he'd hoped. He pulled away from the window, moving silently toward the eastern side of the settlement where Eleanor was being held. A guard, the youngest of Bishop's men, judging by his silhouette, paced before the stone building's entrance, rifle held across his chest. His pattern was regular but not particularly vigilant, suggesting confidence that no threat existed in this isolated location. Gideon circled the building, searching for another entrance, or at least a window through which he might communicate with Eleanor. The structure's thick stone walls offered few openings, however. A defensible position that now worked against his purpose rather than for it. A sudden flurry of activity from the central plaza caught his attention. 2 men emerged from the assay office, heading toward the guard post with lanterns. Gideon ducked into the shadow of a collapsed wagon, watching as Bishop himself approached the young guard. Reynolds, join us at the assay office. We need your assessment of these structural plans before tomorrow's expedition. The young guard, Reynolds, straightened nervously. Sir, what about the prisoner? Bishop waved dismissively. She's secured, and there's nowhere for her to go even if she weren't. This won't take long. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded, falling into step behind his commander. Within moments, the building stood unguarded, a temporary opportunity Gideon hadn't dared hope for. He moved quickly across the open ground, pressing himself against the wall beside the heavy wooden door. It would almost certainly be locked, but without a guard present, he might have time to... The door swung open at his touch, unlocked and unbarred, either carelessness or deliberate choice by the young guard who had seemed reluctant about his assignment. Either way, it presented unexpected opportunity. Gideon slipped inside, closing the door silently behind him. The interior was dark, illuminated only by faint moonlight filtering through a small barred window set high in the opposite wall. He stood motionless, allowing his eyes to adjust while listening for movement. "Who's there?" Eleanor's voice came from the darkness, tense but controlled, without a trace of panic despite her circumstances. Pride surged through Gideon at her composure. "Eleanor," he whispered, moving toward the source of her voice. "It's Gideon." A sharp intake of breath, then the rustle of fabric as she rose from what appeared to be a pallet in the corner. "Gideon? How—" He reached her in 3 swift strides, his hands finding her shoulders in the darkness. The solid reality of her beneath his touch released tension he'd carried since watching her being dragged away during the celebration. "Are you hurt? What have they done to you?" "I'm unharmed," she assured him, her hands coming up to grasp his arms as if confirming his presence was real and not imagined. "Uncomfortable and frightened, but not injured. Bishop believes I have knowledge about the cipher in my locket that I'm withholding. I overheard their plans. They're taking you into the mines tomorrow." Gideon's eyes had adjusted enough to make out her features in the dim light, the familiar contours of her face, smudged with dust but blessedly intact. "I need to get you out of here, tonight." Eleanor shook her head. "There are too many of them, and they're well armed. Even if we escape the settlement, they'd track us easily." Her fingers tightened on his arms. "But I may have found an ally. Reynolds, the young guard. He's conflicted about Bishop's methods, especially after I showed him the petroglyphs that match the Apache prophecy." "Petroglyphs?" Gideon asked, surprised by this unexpected development. "In a tunnel entrance not far from here. Ancient images showing a woman with a crescent mark, like my birthmark, and treasure seekers being destroyed in a mine collapse." Her voice quickened with urgency. "Reynolds took me there last night. The images frightened him. He's superstitious despite his education, and I've been cultivating his doubts about Bishop's intentions regarding the treasure." Gideon absorbed this information, recalculating possibilities. An ally within Bishop's camp could prove invaluable, particularly one assigned to guard Eleanor directly. "Can you trust him?" "Not completely," Eleanor admitted, "but his fear of the prophecy may prove stronger than his loyalty to Bishop, especially if events begin to align with the warnings in the petroglyphs." A sound from outside, voices approaching, cut their conversation short. Gideon glanced toward the door, calculating odds and options. "I can't take you now without raising immediate alarm," he said, the admission painful despite its obvious truth. "But I'll be close, watching for opportunity. Nakoe, an Apache guide, is with me. We'll follow when they take you to the mines tomorrow." "Bishop plans to enter the main ventilation shaft on the 3rd level," Eleanor whispered urgently. "He believes that's where the gold is hidden, based on comparing my locket with his maps." Gideon nodded, filing away this critical information. "If you get an opportunity to escape during the confusion of the mine exploration, take it. Head uphill, away from the settlement. We'll be watching." The voices outside grew louder, the guard returning to his post. Gideon cupped Eleanor's face briefly, the touch conveying what words could not in their limited time. "Be careful," she breathed. "Bishop is becoming desperate. I've delayed him deliberately, and his patience is wearing thin." "You've done well," Gideon told her, genuine admiration in his voice. "Just hold on a little longer. I won't let him take you into those tunnels without protection." He pressed something into her hand, the medicine woman's protective talisman, removed from around his neck. Apache blessing, supposed to protect against the mountain's anger. Eleanor's fingers closed around the small leather pouch. "Go, quickly." With supreme reluctance, Gideon released her and moved toward the door, pausing to listen for approaching footsteps. Hearing none immediately outside, he eased the door open fractionally, scanning the area before slipping out into the darkness. Instead of returning directly the way he had come, Gideon circled behind the row of buildings, intending to search for the assay office's back entrance. If Bishop kept his maps and documents there, additional information about the mine layout might prove crucial for tomorrow's inevitable confrontation. The assay office stood dark now, its occupants apparently having relocated to the guard post for continued discussion. Gideon found a rear window unlocked, the same one through which he had overheard the earlier conversation, and eased himself inside with minimal sound. No lanterns burned within, but moonlight filtering through dusty windows provided enough illumination to navigate the space. A large table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with maps, documents, and surveying instruments. Along one wall stood a bookcase filled with leather-bound volumes, mining records, from the look of them, preserved despite the settlement's abandonment. Gideon moved to the table, careful not to disturb the precise arrangement of materials that would betray his presence. Bishop's methodical nature was evident in the careful organization, documents aligned precisely, writing implements stored in a wooden box, pages weighted with small rocks to prevent shifting in the desert's unpredictable breezes. One map lay prominently atop the others, a detailed rendering of the Las Aguilias mine complex, its tunnels and shafts marked in faded ink, with more recent annotations added in a precise hand that must be Bishop's. Gideon studied it carefully, committing key features to memory: the main entrance, ventilation shafts, areas marked as unstable or collapsed. A series of fresh markings in red ink traced a specific path through the mine: entrance through the main portal, descent to the third level via the primary shaft, then eastward along a tunnel marked Veta Madre, Mother Vein, to a ventilation shaft near its terminus. Circles and notations surrounded this shaft, suggesting it as the most likely location for the hidden Confederate gold. Gideon wished he could take the map, but its absence would be immediately noticed. Instead, he studied it intently for another minute, fixing the route in his mind while searching for alternative approaches that might allow him to intercept Bishop's party once inside the mine. A small leather-bound journal lay beside the map, opened to a page filled with the same precise handwriting. Gideon skimmed it quickly, recognizing calculations relating to celestial alignments and lunar phases. One phrase caught his attention: crescent mark aligns with summer solstice orientation of ventilation shaft, confirming primary location. The reference to a crescent mark seemed too specific to be coincidental, especially given Eleanor's birthmark and the petroglyphs she had mentioned. Was Bishop attempting to align multiple cipher components, the locket markings, astronomical positions, and physical features of the mine itself? Before he could investigate further, the distant sound of boots on hard-packed earth alerted him to approaching men. Gideon carefully restored the journal to its exact position and retreated to the window, slipping outside just as lantern light appeared at the front of the building. He paused in the shadow of a collapsed outbuilding, watching as Bishop and two of his men re-entered the assay office. The colonel moved with the restless energy of a man on the cusp of long-sought achievement, his normally controlled demeanor showing cracks of anticipation, or perhaps anxiety. Dawn wasn't far off. The eastern sky had begun to lighten imperceptibly, the stars fading as night relinquished its hold. Gideon needed to retreat to the rendezvous point where Nakohe waited, but reluctance to leave Eleanor behind made each step away from the settlement physically painful. He had found her, confirmed her relative safety, and even managed brief contact, more than he had realistically hoped for in this initial reconnaissance. Yet leaving felt like abandonment, despite the logical necessity of regrouping and planning with Nakahi before Bishop's expedition entered the mines. As he made his way silently through the rocky terrain toward the ridgeline, Gideon found his thoughts not on tactical considerations, but on the brief moment his hands had touched Eleanor's face in the darkness. Despite her captivity and fear, she had shown remarkable strength and resourcefulness, manipulating divisions among Bishop's men, identifying potential allies, even exploring the petroglyphs to gather information that might aid her escape. She was no longer the desperate but dignified Boston lady who had stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption all those weeks ago. Eleanor Price had adapted to frontier challenges with a resilience that continually surprised and impressed him. Whatever happened within the mountain tomorrow, Gideon knew with bone-deep certainty that they would face it as equal partners rather than rescuer and rescued. The thought steadied him as he climbed the rocky slope toward where Nakohi waited, his mind already racing ahead to formulate a plan that would extract Eleanor from Bishop's grasp before the obsessed colonel could drag her into the unstable depths of a mountain the Apache believed swallowed men whole. Morning sunlight slanted through the dusty windows of the assay office, casting golden bars across the table where Eleanor had spent the last 3 hours bent over maps and documents. Her grandmother's locket lay open beside Bishop's Spanish survey map, its interior markings revealed for comparison with the faded notations along the parchment's borders. Several sheets of paper covered with calculations in Bishop's precise handwriting were arranged in careful order alongside Eleanor's own notes, deliberately obscure and partially misleading. This symbol corresponds with the ventilation shaft marked here, she said, indicating a crescent marking inside the locket that matched a similar shape on the mine diagram. But the orientation suggests it must be read in conjunction with the secondary markings beside it. Bishop leaned closer, his sleeve brushing hers in a familiarity she endured without reaction. The colonel had maintained a facade of gentlemanly courtesy throughout the morning's work, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed growing impatience with the slow progress. "And these secondary markings?" he prompted, tapping the locket's intricate engravings. "What do they signify in relation to the map coordinates?" Eleanor pursed her lips, as if considering deeply, though she had already determined her response, one calculated to seem cooperative while yielding no useful information. "They appear to indicate direction rather than precise location. See how this series of lines radiates outward? My grandmother always emphasized that the locket should be positioned with these lines facing true north. It was pure fabrication, but delivered with just enough conviction to be plausible." Eleanor had spent the morning cultivating Bishop's trust with small insights that appeared meaningful while leading nowhere, interspersed with genuine observations that couldn't be avoided without arousing suspicion. Behind them, Bishop's men shifted restlessly. Jenkins slouched against the wall near the door, occasionally exchanging glances with Mercer, whose dark eyes tracked Bishop's every move with barely concealed resentment. Another man, Bennett, the quiet one with a prominent facial scar, cleaned his fingernails with a knife tip, his bored expression belied by the alertness in his posture. Only Reynolds showed genuine interest in the proceedings, hovering at the edge of the table with scholarly curiosity. "We've been at this for hours," Mercer finally said, pushing away from the wall he'd been leaning against. "The girl's either ignorant or stalling, Colonel. Meanwhile, we're exposed in this location and Hampton's still nowhere to be found." Bishop straightened, his expression cooling as he turned to face his lieutenant. "Your concerns about our tactical situation are noted, Mercer. Your expertise in cryptography and historical cipher systems, however, remains inadequate to judge Miss Price's progress." "Progress?" Mercer scoffed, gesturing toward the table covered with papers. "Looks more like a schoolgirl's geometry lesson than a treasure map. We had clearer direction before bringing her into this." Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though inwardly she noted the deepening division between Bishop and his men, the seeds of doubt she had carefully planted over the past days about Bishop's intentions to share the treasure, about the accuracy of his research, about the very existence of the gold itself, had taken root and begun to flourish. "Perhaps if Miss Price were encouraged more forcefully," Jenkins suggested from his position by the door, the implied threat unmistakable in his tone. "Gentle methods have their limits, Colonel." Bishop's posture shifted subtly, tension gathering in his shoulders as he squared them. "Miss Price is cooperating to the extent of her knowledge," he said, his cultured accent hardening with authority. "Her value lies in her undamaged mental faculties, not in whatever misguided interrogation techniques you're suggesting." "Misguided?" Mercer stepped forward, hands curling into fists at his sides. 2 years we've followed you across this godforsaken territory, chasing ghost stories about Confederate gold. 2 years of promises about riches that would restore the South's glory. And now we're supposed to wait patiently while this Boston socialite pretends to decipher nursery rhymes in her grandmother's trinket? The tension in the room crystallized, sharp enough to cut. Eleanor glanced toward Reynolds, whose youthful features revealed alarm at the confrontation unfolding before them. The young guard had positioned himself slightly closer to her than to his comrades, a small but significant shift in allegiance that hadn't escaped her notice. "Your short-sightedness is disappointing, Mercer," Bishop replied, his voice dangerously soft. "After all we've accomplished, your faith falters at the final hurdle." "Faith?" Mercer barked a harsh laugh. "This isn't a church social, Colonel. It's a business arrangement that's yielded mighty poor returns so far. Maybe it's time we revisited the terms." Bishop moved with surprising speed for a man of his age and bearing. One moment he stood beside Eleanor at the table, the next he was directly before Mercer, invading the younger man's space with calculated intimidation. "The terms of our arrangement were established at the outset," he said quietly. "You pledged loyalty to the cause and obedience to its leadership, meaning myself, in exchange for your share upon successful completion of our objective. If those terms no longer satisfy you, I suggest you reconsider your position before morning." Mercer's face flushed darkly. "Is that a threat, Colonel?" "Merely a clarification," Bishop replied with deadly calm. "Men who cannot be relied upon have no place in an operation of this significance." The challenge hung in the air between them, neither man willing to retreat from the confrontation. Jenkins had straightened from his slouch, hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip. Bennett had ceased pretending disinterest, his attention fixed on the brewing conflict with the sharp assessment of a man calculating which side offered better odds. Eleanor held her breath, recognizing the pivotal moment unfolding before her. If Bishop's authority fractured now, the resulting chaos might provide opportunity for escape or lead to greater danger if the men decided she was a liability rather than an asset. The tension broke when Mercer lunged forward without warning, swinging a wild punch toward Bishop's face. The colonel sidestepped with unexpected grace, using his opponent's momentum to send him crashing into the edge of the table. Maps and documents scattered as Mercer recovered and charged again, this time landing a glancing blow to Bishop's shoulder. Bishop responded with military precision, his fist connecting solidly with Mercer's jaw in a short, efficient strike that spoke of formal boxing training rather than brawling experience. The younger man staggered but did not fall, coming back with renewed fury that sent both men careening into the bookcase along the wall. Eleanor retreated to the far side of the room as the fight escalated, positioning herself near R. Reynolds, who had moved protectively toward her. Jenkins and Bennett made no move to intervene, watching the combat with the calculating detachment of men accustomed to violent resolution of authority disputes. "Get behind me," Reynolds murmured, placing himself between Eleanor and the spreading chaos as Bishop and Mercer grappled among fallen books and scattered papers. The fight ended as suddenly as it had begun. Bishop, despite his age and seemingly genteel background, displayed combat skills that suggested significant military experience beyond his officer's commission. A series of precise blows left Mercer dazed and bloodied, slumped against the overturned table, while Bishop stood over him, barely winded, though his usually immaculate appearance had suffered considerably. "Does anyone else wish to question the chain of command?" Bishop asked, his voice carrying the ring of parade ground authority as he surveyed the room. Jenkins and Bennett exchanged glances, then shook their heads with newfound respect, or at least caution, in their expressions. Reynolds remained silent, his body still angled protectively toward Eleanor rather than aligned with his comrades. Bishop straightened his disheveled clothing with dignity that would have seemed absurd under different circumstances. "Mercer will be confined to the stable until he reconsiders his position. Bennett, Jenkins, secure him there, then return to your assigned duties." The men complied without comment, dragging the semi-conscious Mercer from the room with the efficiency of soldiers following orders, rather than the reluctance of men considering similar rebellion. When they had gone, Bishop turned his attention back to Eleanor, his composure restored with remarkable speed. "My apologies for the unseemly display, Miss Price," he said, as if they had witnessed nothing more alarming than a spilled teacup. "Field operations occasionally require direct leadership intervention." Eleanor nodded acknowledgement, her mind racing to calculate how this development affected her situation. Bishop's authority had been challenged and reasserted, leaving him potentially more vigilant against further threats to his control, including escape attempts. Yet the conflict had also revealed deeper fractures within his organization than she had previously confirmed. "Reynolds, assist Miss Price in organizing these materials," Bishop directed, gesturing toward the scattered maps and documents. "I need to address certain security matters with the men. We'll resume our analysis in 1 hour." After Bishop departed, closing the door firmly behind him, Reynolds immediately moved closer to Eleanor. "Are you all right?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice as he began gathering papers from the floor. "That was unexpected." "I'm unharmed," Eleanor assured him, kneeling to help collect the fallen items while keeping her voice low. "Though I fear the Colonel's patience is wearing dangerously thin." Reynolds glanced toward the door, then leaned closer under the pretense of retrieving a map that had slid beneath the table. "I saw riders watching the camp from the ridgeline yesterday," he whispered urgently. "A white man and what looked like an Apache guide they were observing through field glasses." Hope surged through Eleanor so powerfully she nearly gasped aloud. Gideon? It had to be Gideon, with the Apache translator she had met in town. He was alive, and he had found her trail. "Are you certain?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Reynolds nodded. "I was checking the perimeter when I spotted them. I didn't report it to the Colonel. I'm not sure why, except..." He hesitated, glancing again toward the door. "After seeing those petroglyphs, I've been thinking about what you said. About greed and destruction and the warnings we've ignored." Eleanor studied his face, recognizing genuine moral conflict beneath the youthful features. Reynolds had joined Bishop's quest believing in noble purpose, only to find himself participating in kidnapping and threats of violence against a woman whose only crime was possessing an heirloom sought by men obsessed with lost Confederate gold. "Reynolds," she said softly, making a swift decision. "I'm going to tell you something important, and I need you to listen carefully." His eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "The riders you saw include a man named Gideon Kane, a bounty hunter, but also..." She hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity, "someone who matters deeply to me. I believe he's planning a rescue attempt, possibly tonight or tomorrow." Reynolds swallowed hard, the implications clear in his troubled expression. "What are you asking of me, Miss Price?" "Nothing that violates your conscience," she replied. "But if circumstances arise where you must choose between loyalty to Bishop's increasingly desperate obsession and preventing needless bloodshed, I hope you'll remember the petroglyphs and their warning." He was silent for a long moment, conflict evident in his expression. Then he nodded once, the gesture small but significant. "The Colonel intends to enter the mines tomorrow if you provide coordinates tonight. He's grown impatient with delays." "Then I need to give him something," Eleanor said, mind racing ahead to formulate a plan. "Not accurate information, but convincing enough to satisfy him temporarily." Reynolds hesitated. "Is the locket truly a cipher key? Do you actually understand its meaning?" Eleanor shook her head. "No more than I've claimed all along. My grandmother never explained its significance, but I believe I can construct a translation that will direct Bishop to a specific location without endangering whatever treasure might actually exist." "A false lead," Reynolds murmured, understanding dawning in his eyes. "One that might buy time for..." She didn't complete the thought, but Reynolds nodded, understanding the implication. They worked in silence after that, restoring order to the scattered materials, while Eleanor's mind processed this new information. Gideon was alive and nearby, almost certainly planning a rescue attempt. Her task now was to survive until that opportunity arrived, while creating circumstances that maximized chances for success. When Bishop returned an hour later, she was ready. She had arranged the maps and documents in an order suggesting methodical progress, with her locket positioned precisely over a specific section of the mine diagram. "I believe I've found the alignment," she announced as Bishop approached the table, her voice carrying careful measure of excitement and uncertainty. "The crescent marking corresponds with this ventilation shaft in the central tunnel, but only when oriented according to the summer solstice position my grandmother always emphasized." Bishop studied her work, his expression sharpening with renewed interest. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without actually entering the mine to confirm," Eleanor replied, the qualification both truthful and calculated to maintain credibility. "These secondary markings suggest specific features that should be visible within the shaft itself. Perhaps carved symbols similar to those found in the petroglyphs." The reference to petroglyphs was deliberate, reminding Reynolds of their shared knowledge while planting seeds of superstitious concern in Bishop's mind, without revealing that she knew about his nocturnal expedition with the young guard. Bishop traced the indicated location on the map, a secondary ventilation shaft in the mine's central section, deliberately distant from the eastern tunnel where his own calculations had suggested the treasure might be hidden. "This contradicts my previous analysis," he said, skepticism evident in his tone. Eleanor had anticipated this objection. "The markings are designed to mislead casual examination," she explained. "My grandmother once mentioned that our family locket contained truths visible only to those who know how to look. I believe she was referring to this specific orientation, which reveals alignments not obvious in other positions. It was a masterful blend of fabrication and plausible deduction, delivered with just enough hesitation to suggest genuine recollection rather than calculated deception." Bishop studied her face, searching for signs of dishonesty, then returned his attention to the map with renewed intensity. "We'll explore this shaft tomorrow at first light," he decided finally. "Reynolds, inform the men to prepare necessary equipment. Ropes, lanterns, excavation tools. I want everything ready for immediate departure after breakfast." "Yes, sir," Reynolds replied, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes met Eleanor's briefly as he turned to leave. "Well done, Miss Price," Bishop said when they were alone, his tone carrying something almost like genuine approval. "I had begun to fear your grandmother's instruction had been less thorough than anticipated." Eleanor accepted the compliment with a modest nod, concealing the swell of satisfaction at having successfully maneuvered Bishop exactly where she wanted him. Committed to exploring a section of the mine far from where his own research suggested the treasure might be located, buying precious time for whatever rescue Gideon might be planning. "The locket has been in my family for generations," she said, closing it carefully and replacing it on its chain around her neck. "I'm merely fulfilling my grandmother's trust by ensuring it serves its proper purpose." Bishop studied her with narrowed eyes, as if sensing layers of meaning in her words beyond their surface cooperation. But whatever suspicions might have flickered through his mind remained unexpressed as he gathered his maps with renewed energy. "Rest this afternoon," he instructed, his tone once again that of a commander addressing a subordinate. "Tomorrow's expedition will be physically demanding, especially for someone unaccustomed to mine environments." As Eleanor was escorted back to her stone prison by Reynolds, hope thrummed beneath her composed exterior like a heartbeat. Gideon was out there, watching and planning. She had successfully directed Bishop toward a false location, and Reynolds, while not yet an active ally, had taken first steps away from blind loyalty toward independent moral judgment. For the first time since her abduction, Eleanor allowed herself to believe she might actually escape this ordeal alive, not merely as a passive victim awaiting rescue, but as an active participant in her own liberation. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rugged terrain above the mining settlement, Gideon. Enin Nakohe crouched within a natural hollow beside a tiny seep, barely enough water to justify the term spring, but sufficient to sustain them while they observed Bishop's camp below and debated rescue strategies. Direct assault would fail, Nakohe stated flatly, studying the settlement through narrowed eyes. 6 men, all armed, with clear fields of fire from multiple positions. Even if we killed several immediately, the Boston woman would likely die before we reached her. Gideon nodded grimly, having reached the same conclusion during his own tactical assessment. Bishop's men maintained regular patrols around the settlement perimeter, and Eleanor remained closely guarded despite the apparent absence of external threats. The young guard, Reynolds, had escorted her back to the stone building after the morning's session in the assay office, and now stood watch outside her door. "We need a diversion," Gideon said, accepting the water skin Nakohe offered. "Something significant enough to draw multiple men away from their positions, without immediately suggesting an attack." "Something that would panic them rather than alert them," Nakoye agreed. He was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful as he traced patterns in the dusty soil with one finger. "Among my people, certain signs are feared even by the bravest warriors, signs that suggest angry spirits or the mountains awakening hunger." Gideon raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite his usual pragmatism. "What kind of signs?" "Stones arranged in specific patterns near water sources. Animal bones placed to cast certain shadows. Symbols drawn in places no human should be able to reach." Nako's voice took on the rhythmic quality of traditional teaching. These things frighten even hardened men if they appear suddenly and without explanation. And you believe Bishop's men would be affected by such manifestations? Gideon asked, careful to keep skepticism from his tone out of respect for his companion's beliefs. Nakohe met his gaze directly. The men themselves, perhaps not. But Reynolds, the young one who guards the woman, he already fears the prophecy. I saw his face when he escorted her back to the stone building. He watches the mountain with dread in his eyes. Gideon recalled Eleanor's words during their brief reunion. Reynolds, the young guard. He's conflicted about Bishop's methods, especially after I showed him the petroglyphs that match the Apache prophecy. If she had indeed been cultivating the young man's superstitious fears, Nakoe's suggestion might exploit an existing vulnerability. What exactly are you proposing? He asked, his tactical mind already considering practical application. Tonight, while they sleep, we create signs of the mountain's displeasure, Nakoe explained, his finger drawing more complex patterns in the dust. Symbols at the well where they draw water. Animal bones arranged in the pattern of the death wave. Strange sounds that come from everywhere and nowhere. Things a white man might dismiss in daylight, but that gnaw at courage in darkness. The plan was unorthodox by military standards, but Gideon had learned through bitter experience that unconventional tactics often succeeded where direct approaches failed. And there was undeniable logic to exploiting existing tensions and fears rather than confronting Bishop's superior numbers head-on. And while they're distracted by these manifestations, he prompted, we separate the young one, Reynolds, from the others, Nakyohe continued. Grandmother believes he stands at a crossroads between paths. With proper encouragement, he might choose to help the marked woman rather than follow Bishop into destruction. Gideon considered this assessment. Eleanor seemed to believe Reynolds could be turned against Bishop under the right circumstances. If that proved true, having an ally inside the camp might make the difference between success and failure. It's risky, he said finally, relying on a man's superstition and moral qualms rather than direct action. Less risky than charging 6 armed men who expect attack, Nakoe countered. And the mountain itself may help us. Look, he pointed toward the eastern horizon, where dark clouds had begun massing despite the season's typical clear skies. Storm comes, unusual for this time of year. Perhaps the spirits have already decided to intervene. Gideon studied the gathering thunderheads with cautious hope. A storm would provide additional cover for their approach, masking sounds and forcing Bishop's men to seek shelter rather than maintaining optimal defensive positions. Whether divine intervention or simple meteorological chance, it represented tactical advantage they would be foolish to ignore. Very well, he decided. We'll implement your plan tonight. If the diversion succeeds and we manage to separate Reynolds from the others, I'll approach him directly, offer safe passage in exchange for helping Eleanor escape. Nakohe nodded approval. And if he refuses? Gideon's expression hardened. Then we proceed to the contingency plan. Create enough chaos to extract Eleanor by force using the storm as cover. They spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing for the night's operation. Nakohe gathered materials for his spirit signs, specific stones from the stream bed, small animal bones found among the rocks, ochre clay for markings that would appear blood red in lantern light. Gideon cleaned his weapons and studied the crude map of the mine complex he had sketched from memory after seeing Bishop's detailed version. If we can't extract Eleanor tonight, we'll need to follow them into the mine tomorrow, he said, indicating the ventilation shaft Bishop had marked as his primary target. This section has experienced previous collapses. The entire eastern tunnel is unstable. The mountain remembers blood spilled within its depths, Nakohe agreed, glancing at the approaching storm clouds that had grown more ominous as afternoon faded toward evening. It will not welcome those who enter with greed in their hearts. As the first distant rumble of thunder reached them, Nakohe set aside his preparations and moved to a flat rock overlooking the valley below. He removed a small pouch from around his neck, extracting pinches of what appeared to be various herbs and crushed plants. These he arranged in a small circle on the stone, adding a central portion that he set alight with flint and steel. Thin smoke rose from the smoldering offering, curling upward toward the darkening sky. Nachkohe began a low chant in his native language, his voice carrying neither urgency nor demand, but rather respectful entreaty. Gideon watched silently, recognizing a ritual that transcended his own understanding, but deserved respect nonetheless. When the chant concluded, Nachkohe returned to their small camp, his expression serene despite the gravity of their impending mission. "You asked the mountain spirits for assistance," Gideon observed, not quite a question. Nachkohe nodded. "I reminded them of the prophecy regarding the marked woman and asked that they recognize you as her protector rather than her captor." A slight smile touched his lips. "The spirits understand the difference between those who take and those who safeguard." Gideon accepted this with a nod, finding himself unable to dismiss the young Apache's spiritual certainties, despite his own more pragmatic worldview. After all, the storm now gathering on the horizon was indeed unusual for the season, and the coincidence of Eleanor's crescent birthmark matching ancient petroglyphs defied simple explanation. "We move as soon as full darkness falls," he said, checking his revolver one final time before returning it to its holster. "The storm should reach the settlement shortly thereafter, providing additional cover for our approach." Below in the mining settlement, activity had increased as Bishop's men prepared for the coming storm. Gideon observed them securing loose equipment, reinforcing makeshift shelters, and gathering additional firewood before the rain arrived. Through his field glass, he could see Bishop himself directing operations with military precision, his authority apparently unquestioned despite the earlier confrontation Gideon had glimpsed from a distance. There was no sign of Eleanor, presumably still confined to the stone building under Reynolds' guard. The young man had maintained his post, despite the preparations occurring around him, further evidence of Bishop's prioritization of keeping Eleanor secure. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, staining the dusty ground with dark patches, Gideon turned to Nakai with grim determination etched in his features. "Time to move," he said simply. Meanwhile, in her stone prison, Eleanor sat on the edge of her pallet, listening to the first rumbles of thunder with growing anticipation. The approaching storm represented both opportunity and complication, potential cover for rescue attempts, but also increased danger should Bishop proceed with his planned mine expedition tomorrow despite worsened conditions. Reynolds had brought her evening meal with unusual solemnity, his manner suggesting internal conflict that had only deepened since their conversation in the assay office. He had mentioned the storm, noting that Bishop remained determined to enter the mines at first light regardless of weather. "The colonel believes we've waited long enough," he had explained, keeping his voice low though they were alone. "Equipment is being prepared now. Ropes, lanterns, excavation tools. He intends to reach the central ventilation shaft before midday." Eleanor had nodded, understanding, maintaining her outward composure while inwardly calculating how this information might be conveyed to Gideon if opportunity arose. The false location she had identified would lead Bishop deep into the mine complex, far from the eastern tunnel where his own research suggested the treasure might be hidden. It would buy time, but also place them all within unstable tunnels beneath thousands of tons of rock. Now, as rain began pattering against the small window of her prison, Eleanor reached beneath her collar to touch her grandmother's locket. The familiar weight of it against her palm provided strange comfort, despite its role in her current predicament. Whatever secrets it truly contained, cipher key or mere family sentiment, she found herself grateful for its presence as tangible connection to her past, even as she faced uncertain future. A particularly loud thunderclap rattled the window, followed almost immediately by a brilliant flash of lightning that illuminated her small cell with harsh white clarity. The storm was nearly overhead now, its intensity unusual even by frontier standards, where weather extremes were common. Eleanor rose and moved to the window, standing on tiptoe to peer through the bars at the turbulent sky above. Rain had begun falling in earnest, turning the hard-packed earth of the settlement to swiftly forming mud. Bishop's men hurried between buildings, heads bent against the downpour as they completed final preparations before seeking shelter. Something moved at the edge of her vision, a shadow detaching itself from deeper darkness near the perimeter of the settlement. Eleanor strained to see, but the figure, if it was indeed a human form rather than trick of lightning and rain, vanished before she could confirm its presence. Hope surged within her chest. Gideon would use the storm as cover. Perhaps even now he was implementing whatever rescue plan he had developed with his Apache companion. Her task was to remain ready, alert to opportunity when it presented itself. Eleanor returned to her pallet, gathering the few possessions she had managed to retain during her captivity. The talisman Gideon had pressed into her hand during their brief reunion, a sharp stone she had found and concealed as potential weapon, and the medicine woman's protective pouch given to her in redemption. She secured these within her bodice, then arranged her blanket to suggest a sleeping form should anyone check on her without entering fully. Whatever happened in the coming hours, she would face it prepared rather than passive, a partner in her own liberation rather than merely its object. The storm raged outside, nature's fury providing backdrop to human conflict poised on the cusp of resolution. Thunder rolled across the valley like distant cannon fire, a sound Eleanor had never heard in person, but that Gideon had once described during their quiet evenings at the homestead. She thought of those evenings now, the peaceful routine they had established, the growing closeness that had transformed initial wariness to deep connection. The memory strengthened her resolve. Whatever dangers lay ahead in the storm-swept darkness or the mountain's depths tomorrow, Eleanor Price would face them with the same courage and resourcefulness that had sustained her through every challenge since leaving Boston's familiar confines. She was no longer merely surviving circumstances thrust upon her, but actively shaping her own destiny, alongside a man whose unlikely appearance in her life had transformed them both in ways neither could have anticipated. Outside, the storm's intensity increased, rain lashing against stone walls with percussive force. Lightning split the sky in jagged brilliance, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of her prison. Within this elemental fury, Eleanor waited with outward patience and inward determination, ready for whatever opportunity fate or Gideon's planning might provide. Chapter 10. Into the Mountain. Dawn broke with unnatural stillness over Las Aguilas. The previous night's storm had passed, yet the atmosphere remained charged with tension, as if the very air waited in suspension for events about to unfold. Heavy clouds hung low on the horizon, neither advancing nor retreating, while occasional thunder rumbled in the distance, despite an absence of rain. Eleanor stood beside Reynolds, near the main mine entrance, her body rigid with controlled fear as Bishop's men gathered equipment for their expedition. The night had passed without rescue attempt or opportunity for escape, leaving her with no choice but to accompany Bishop into the mountain as both guide and hostage. "Final equipment check," Bishop called out, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a man accustomed to military command. "Jenkins, verify the lanterns. Bennett, rope coils and picks. Reynolds, maintain watch on Miss Price while I complete the map review." Eleanor studied the mine entrance with growing apprehension. The timber supports framing the opening had weathered to silver gray over decades of abandonment, their surfaces cracked and splintered in places that suggested dangerous deterioration. Above the entrance, crude letters in Spanish had been chiseled into the living rock, "Vaya con Dios," "Go with God." The warning seemed ominous in the strange half-light of the storm-shadowed morning. Bishop approached, his expression revealing satisfaction that bordered on triumph as he surveyed the final preparations. "Your locket, Miss Price," he said, extending his hand with the expectation of immediate compliance. Eleanor hesitated, her fingers rising instinctively to touch the silver oval that had been her constant companion since childhood. Though she had deliberately misdirected Bishop regarding its significance, surrendering it felt like relinquishing the last tangible connection to her family and former life. "It's necessary for proper orientation within the tunnels," Bishop added impatiently. "You'll have it returned once we've located the cache." With reluctance she couldn't entirely conceal, Eleanor removed the chain from around her neck, placing the locket in Bishop's outstretched palm. He accepted it with the satisfied air of a collector acquiring a long-sought prize, opening it immediately to study the interior markings, before securing it in his vest pocket. "Mercer, take point with the lead lantern," Bishop instructed, turning to his men gathered before the mine entrance. The lieutenant had been released from confinement that morning, his expression sullenly subservient, though the bruises from their confrontation still marked his face. "Jenkins and Bennett will follow with excavation equipment. Reynolds, escort Miss Price directly behind me. We maintain close formation at all times. The tunnels can be disorienting for the uninitiated." Eleanor noted the men's expressions as they prepared to enter the mine. Despite their hardened appearance and frontier experience, none seemed eager to venture into the mountain's depths. Jenkins kept glancing toward the strange thunderclouds, muttering what might have been prayers under his breath. Bennett maintained stoic silence, but his movements betrayed unusual hesitation for such a typically efficient man. Even Mercer's belligerence had subdued to grim resignation as he lit the lead lantern and stepped toward the dark opening. Only Reynolds met her eyes directly, his youthful features showing concern that went beyond general apprehension. He had seen the same petroglyphs she had, the warnings of destruction that awaited those who entered the mountain with greed in their hearts. Whatever loyalty he still maintained to Bishop struggled visibly against growing fear of consequences foretold in ancient images. "Forward," Bishop commanded, gesturing toward the entrance with the authoritative bearing of a man who expected immediate obedience, despite his subordinates' obvious reluctance. Mercer ducked through the timber-framed opening, his lantern casting elongated shadows that danced across rough-hewn walls as he descended into the main tunnel. The others followed in designated order, Eleanor positioned between Bishop and Reynolds as they entered the mountain's dark embrace. The temperature dropped noticeably as they moved deeper into the main shaft, the hot June air outside giving way to subterranean coolness that raised goose flesh on Eleanor's arms beneath her torn dress sleeves. The tunnel walls bore evidence of systematic excavation, chisel marks, blast patterns, and occasional support beams inserted where natural rock formations provided insufficient stability. Eleanor studied these supports with growing concern as their party advanced. Many showed signs of advanced rot, darkened wood, fungal growth in the perpetual dampness, even visible sagging beneath the weight they were intended to bear. She wasn't experienced in mining operations, but even a layperson could recognize dangerous deterioration when support timbers visibly bowed under pressure. "The main shaft continues for another 100 yards before reaching the first junction," Bishop explained, his voice echoing oddly in the confined space. "From there, we'll descend to the third level via the primary shaft, then proceed to the central ventilation tunnel as indicated by the locket cipher." Thunder rumbled overhead, the sound penetrating even through layers of rock. Fine dust sifted down from the tunnel ceiling, sparkling in the lantern light like malevolent stars. Jenkins cursed softly, brushing particles from his shoulder with obvious discomfort. "Storm shouldn't be affecting us this deep," he muttered. "Ain't natural." "Your meteorological expertise is noted, Jenkins," Bishop replied with cold sarcasm. "Perhaps focus instead on maintaining proper distance between yourself and Bennett. Bunching together creates unnecessary hazard in these conditions." They continued forward, the tunnel beginning a gradual descent that would eventually lead to deeper levels of the mine complex. Eleanor concentrated on memorizing their route, counting paces between junctions, and noting distinctive features that might guide her if opportunity for escape presented itself. The false location she had identified lay in the central section of the mine, not directly dangerous according to the maps she had studied, but far from where Bishop's own research suggested the treasure might be hidden. As they approached the first major junction, Eleanor became aware of an unusual sensation emanating from her wrist. The crescent birthmark that had drawn the Apache medicine woman's attention seemed to warm against her skin, not uncomfortably, but noticeably, like the gentle heat of sunlight focused through glass. She glanced down, half expecting to see it glowing in the dim tunnel light, but it appeared unchanged, despite the strange warmth it radiated. "Junction ahead," Mercer called back, his lantern illuminating a place where 3 separate tunnels intersected with the main shaft. Crude symbols had been carved into the central support beam, Spanish numerals indicating tunnel designations, Eleanor presumed, though some appeared more recent than others. "Left passage," she instructed, following the false route she had committed to memory. "The map indicates descent to lower levels through a shaft approximately 50 yards along this tunnel." Bishop consulted his own notes, comparing them with the route she had indicated. His expression revealed momentary doubt, quickly concealed. "You're certain? My calculation suggested the eastern tunnel might be more promising." "The locket markings are quite specific when properly aligned," Eleanor replied. injecting her voice with scholarly certainty despite the fabrication. The central ventilation shaft can only be accessed via this route. After a moment's hesitation, Bishop nodded. Proceed, Mercer. Left passage is indicated. Their party turned into the designated tunnel, which narrowed considerably compared to the main shaft. The ceiling lowered, forcing the taller men to duck beneath occasional support beams. These timbers appeared even more degraded than those in the main entrance, with visible cracks running along their length and alarming soft spots where fungal growth had compromised structural integrity. Another rumble of thunder penetrated from above, stronger than before despite their increasing depth. More dust showered down, along with small pebbles that clattered against the packed earth of the tunnel floor. The men's nervousness became palpable, evident in tightened grips on equipment and darting glances toward the ceiling. "Couldn't we have waited for the storm to pass, Colonel?" Reynolds asked, his voice tight with barely controlled apprehension. "These supports don't look particularly stable. Advancing weather front is expected to stall over this region for days," Bishop replied dismissively. "We proceed as planned. The structural integrity of these tunnels has withstood far worse than distant thunder over the decades." As if challenging his assertion, a louder boom shook the mountain, distinct from thunder in both character and intensity. The entire tunnel seemed to shudder in response. A support beam 10 yards ahead creaked ominously, sagging visibly under pressure from above. "That wasn't thunder," Jenkins said, his voice rising with alarm. "That was within the mountain itself. Colonel, we should retreat to the main entrance until—" "We continue forward," Bishop interrupted sharply. "These mines have stood for nearly a century. They won't choose today to collapse." But his words carried less conviction than before, and Eleanor noticed his hand had moved to rest on his holstered revolver, a gesture suggesting he anticipated resistance from his increasingly frightened men. The strange warmth from Eleanor's birthmark intensified as they passed beneath the straining support beam. She resisted the urge to clutch her wrist, not wanting to draw attention to her discomfort or the possibly supernatural phenomenon occurring. The sensation wasn't painful, but its timing seemed too significant to be coincidental. Awakening as they ventured deeper into a mountain the Apache believed took vengeance against the greedy. They reached the primary shaft that would take them to the mine's third level, a square opening in the tunnel floor with rotted wooden ladder rungs descending into greater darkness below. Mercer held his lantern over the opening, revealing the first 10 feet of descent before light gave way to impenetrable blackness. "Secure the rope lines here," Bishop ordered. "We'll descend one at a time, maintaining communication through the shaft. Mercer first with the lead lantern, followed by Bennett, myself, Miss Price, Reynolds, and Jenkins bringing up the rear." As the men prepared the lines and tested the stability of the ancient ladder, Eleanor's birthmark burned with such intensity she had to bite her lip to prevent gasping aloud. Something was happening, something beyond natural explanation or coincidence. Whether warning or message, her body was responding to forces she couldn't explain but dared not ignore. Reynolds moved beside her, ostensibly adjusting rope coils but positioning himself to speak without being overheard. "The supports near the bottom of this shaft were compromised even before the mine was abandoned," he murmured. "Historical records mention multiple minor collapses in this section. Are you certain this is the correct route?" Eleanor met his troubled gaze, recognizing the moment of decision that had been approaching since their nocturnal visit to the petroglyphs. "I've led us exactly where we need to go," she replied softly, the double meaning clear in her deliberate emphasis. Understanding flickered in Reynolds' eyes, followed by resignation and then something approaching resolve. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then moved away as Mercer began his descent into the shaft. One by one, the party descended into deeper darkness, the strange atmospheric thunder continuing to rumble above while the mountain itself seemed to answer with internal tremors that dislodged increasing amounts of dust and debris from tunnel walls. Eleanor's birthmark pulsed with warmth that spread up her arm as she carefully navigated the rotted ladder rungs, following Bishop into depths that felt less like a mine and more like a living entity awakening from long dormancy. Whatever awaited them in the central ventilation shaft, Eleanor sensed it had been anticipating their arrival for longer than any human lifetime. Perhaps since the ancient petroglyphs were first etched into stone by hands long since returned to dust. The secondary mine entrance had been nearly invisible beneath decades of accumulated debris and rockfall. Only Nakoe's intimate knowledge of the mountain had allowed them to locate it. A narrow opening, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, partially concealed behind a lightning-blasted juniper whose twisted trunk had grown to shield the abandoned access point. Gideon went first, easing his body through the constricted passage with careful movements that minimized pressure on his healing ribs. The derringer, tucked in his boot, scraped against stone as he navigated the final narrowing, emerging into a rough-hewn tunnel that smelled of mineral-laden dampness and ancient dust. Nakoe followed with surprising grace for a man his size, silent as shadow despite the challenging entry. He carried a small skin pouch containing various materials for the spirit signs they had placed throughout the settlement during the night. Ochre clay, crushed herbs, specific stones gathered from the streambed. These signs had produced their intended effect, creating visible unease among Bishop's men as they prepared for the mine expedition at dawn. "Bishop entered the main shaft 20 minutes ago," Gideon said quietly, unfolding the crude map he had sketched from memory. 6 people total: Bishop, Eleanor, and 4 men, all armed except Eleanor. Nakoe nodded, unslinging the rifle from his back and checking its loading with practiced efficiency. "This tunnel connects with the main shaft after approximately 400 paces," he said, his normally expressionless face showing unusual tension in the dim light of their covered lantern. "But the mountain feels awake. We should proceed with great caution." Gideon had learned to respect Nakoe's perceptions, whether based on practical observation or spiritual awareness. The strange weather, thunder without rain, clouds that neither advanced nor retreated, certainly supported the sense that natural forces were behaving abnormally around Las Aguilas today. "Lead on," he said simply. "Your knowledge of these passages exceeds mine." They advanced through the narrow tunnel, moving with deliberate silence despite the improbability of being heard by Bishop's party in separate passages. Years of tracking dangerous quarry had ingrained habits of stealth that served well in these uncertain conditions. At the first junction, where their tunnel intersected briefly with a larger passage before continuing on a parallel track, Nakoe paused. He removed ochre clay from his pouch, quickly drawing a symbol on the wall where it would be visible to anyone passing through the larger tunnel. The mark resembled a crescent moon with radiating lines, similar to Eleanor's birthmark, but embellished with Apache symbology that Gideon didn't recognize. "Warning to those who follow," Nakoe explained, adding smaller marks around the central symbol. "It tells of greedy hearts consumed by the mountain's hunger. Will Bishop's men understand its meaning?" Gideon asked as they continued forward. "Not its specific message, but humans recognize warnings even in languages they cannot speak." Nakoe moved with increasing caution as the tunnel began a gradual descent. "The young one," Reynolds, "has seen the ancient petroglyphs. He will understand enough to fear." They proceeded deeper into the mountain, Nakoe leaving additional symbols at key junctions and intersections. The Apache moved with the assurance of someone retracing familiar territory, despite having never personally entered these specific tunnels. When Gideon commented on this, Nakoe's response was typically enigmatic. "Grandmother showed me these paths in vision dreams 3 nights before the marked woman was taken," he said. As if this explained everything. Perhaps to him it did. The tunnel system grew more complex as they descended, branching and rejoining in patterns that would have been disorienting without Gideon's sketched map and Nakoe's uncanny sense of direction. Support timbers appeared with increasing frequency, many showing dangerous deterioration from decades of neglect. Twice they were forced to navigate around minor collapses where sections of tunnel had partially filled with fallen rock. As they approached what Gideon's map indicated should be the second level of the mine complex, Nakoe suddenly froze, raising one hand in silent warning. Gideon immediately halted, hand moving to his holstered revolver as he listened for whatever had alerted his companion. Thunder rumbled above. Not the atmospheric thunder from the strange storm outside, but a deeper, more visceral vibration that seemed to emanate from within the mountain itself. Fine dust sifted down from the tunnel ceiling, catching the dim light of their covered lantern like settling snow. "The mountain speaks," Nakoe murmured, his expression solemn in the muted light. It grows angry with those who enter seeking only to take. Before Gideon could respond, a more substantial tremor shook the tunnel, dislodging small stones from the walls and ceiling. Both men pressed themselves against the more stable rock face until the shaking subsided. Natural earthquake or angry mountain? These tunnels won't tolerate much more disturbance, Gideon observed grimly. We need to reach Eleanor before the whole complex becomes unstable. They increased their pace, descending via a narrow service shaft to the 3rd level where Bishop's party was likely headed based on Eleanor's deliberate misdirection. As they moved deeper, Gideon began noticing markings on the tunnel walls that differed from both the Spanish mining notations and Nakoe's recently placed warnings. These were older petroglyphs, etched and painted directly onto the living rock in places where miners had broken through to natural cave systems during excavation. The images depicted stylized human figures, celestial symbols, and animals rendered with surprising sophistication given their apparent age. Apache ancestors, Nakohe confirmed, pausing briefly to study a particularly elaborate grouping. They discovered these caves centuries before Spanish miners arrived, sacred places where vision seekers communed with mountain spirits. What are they depicting? Gideon asked, noting the recurring crescent symbol that appeared with conspicuous frequency among the ancient images. Nakoe traced the outline of one petroglyph sequence without touching its surface. This tells of the prophecy Eleanor bears on her skin, the marked woman who comes from distant lands, carrying power to bring either destruction or renewal. His finger moved to another grouping. Here, men seeking treasure within the mountain meet death when the earth shifts beneath them. But here, he indicated a separate panel showing figures arranged in a different pattern around a central crescent symbol. Those who enter with pure hearts are guided safely by the Marked One. 2 possible outcomes from the same prophecy, Gideon observed. The path divides according to intention, Nakohe agreed. Those seeking only personal gain find only darkness. Those protecting what is precious find light. While Gideon's practical nature resisted attributing conscious intention to a mountain, he couldn't deny the ancient warning's unsettling relevance to their current situation. Bishop sought Confederate gold with obsessive fervor, driven by ideology warped into personal fanaticism over years of nursing defeated ambitions. If any man embodied the greedy heart warned against in petroglyphs and Apache tradition, it was Harlan Bishop. They continued forward, the tunnel widening as it joined what appeared to be a primary excavation route on the mine's 3rd level. Support beams grew more substantial here, though still showing dangerous deterioration after decades of abandonment. Timber creaked ominously with each minor tremor that passed through the mountain, suggesting the entire structure existed in precarious balance that could shift toward catastrophic failure with minimal additional pressure. Listen, Nakohe whispered suddenly, freezing in place. Gideon stilled, concentrating on filtering ambient sounds of settling rock and distant thunder. Then he heard it. Human voices, distorted by echo but unmistakable, coming from a tunnel that intersected their path approximately 30 yards ahead. Structurally compromised, a voice argued. Young, educated, almost certainly Reynolds based on the limited interaction Gideon had observed. Colonel, these support beams won't tolerate additional stress if the tremors continue. Your expertise in mining engineering remains incomplete, Reynolds. Bishop's cultured Virginia accent carried clearly despite the distortion. We proceed as planned. The ventilation shaft should be approximately 50 yards ahead, according to Miss Price's translation. Eleanor's voice followed, too distant to distinguish specific words, but recognizable to Gideon through tone and cadence. The sound of it, alive, unharmed despite her ordeal, sent relief washing through him like physical warmth. He turned to Nakohe, pointing toward a narrower side tunnel that roughly paralleled the one Bishop's party was traversing. According to his mental map, both passages should converge at a junction near the central ventilation shaft Eleanor had identified as their false destination. Nakoe nodded, understanding. They could move ahead through the secondary tunnel, establishing position at the junction before Bishop's group arrived. Ideal circumstances for ambush if necessary, or observation if better opportunities presented themselves. They advanced swiftly but with continued caution, conscious that sound carried unpredictably through the mine's labyrinthine passages. The side tunnel showed less evidence of regular use during the mine's operational period, support beams appeared at irregular intervals, and the walls retained more natural contours rather than the systematic excavation evident in primary routes. More petroglyphs appeared as they progressed, increasingly elaborate and numerous. Entire sections of wall had been converted to spiritual canvas by ancient artists, depicting complex narratives that blended physical events with mystical elements in ways that transcended simplistic categorization as either history or religion. Nakohe paused briefly at one particularly extensive panel, his expression shifting from typical reserve to something approaching reverence. "This is unexpected," he murmured, studying the images with intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "What does it show?" Gideon asked, dividing his attention between the petroglyphs and the sounds of Bishop's party growing louder as their paths converged. "The original prophecy in its complete form," Nakohe replied, his finger hovering near but not touching an elaborate central image. The marked woman standing between mountain spirits and men with weapons. Her choice determines whether destruction or renewal follows. He turned to Gideon, unusual urgency in his typically composed features. "These images are sacred teaching, not meant for those outside the medicine tradition. Their presence here, where miners would encounter them, suggests deliberate warning placed by my ancestors." Another tremor shook the tunnel before Gideon could respond, stronger than previous vibrations and accompanied by an ominous cracking sound from the nearest support beam. Both men pressed against the more stable natural rock wall until the shaking subsided. "We're running out of time," Gideon said grimly. "The entire structure is destabilizing. We need to reach Eleanor and extract her before a major collapse becomes inevitable." Nakohe nodded agreement. They continued forward with increased urgency, the sounds of Bishop's party now clearly audible as the tunnels converged toward the central junction. Gideon could distinguish individual voices, Jenkins arguing for retreat, Mercer maintaining sullen silence, broken only by occasional terse reports on tunnel conditions, Reynolds repeatedly expressing concern about structural stability, and Eleanor, her voice calm despite circumstances, providing direction with confidence that Gideon recognized as partially fabricated. She was playing a dangerous game, leading Bishop toward a false location while trying to maintain credibility long enough for rescue or escape opportunity to manifest. They reached the junction first, positioning themselves in shadowed recess where the side tunnel opened into the larger central passage. From this vantage point, they could observe Bishop's approach without immediate detection, while maintaining access to multiple escape routes should circumstances require rapid withdrawal. "No unnecessary risks," Gideon whispered to Nakohe as they established position. "Eleanor's safety takes priority over confronting Bishop or his men. If opportunity presents itself to extract her without direct conflict, we take it immediately." Nakohe nodded, checking his rifle one final time before settling into perfect stillness, the focused patience of a hunter awaiting prey. Gideon assumed similar readiness, his revolver drawn but held at his side, attention fixed on the tunnel from which Bishop's party would emerge momentarily. The mountain shuddered again, another tremor passing through its ancient bones with sufficient force to dislodge small stones from the ceiling. Dust filled the air, glittering in the distant glow of approaching lanterns. The junction's central support beam, a mass of timber that bore weight from converging passages, creaked ominously, a visible crack extending along its weathered surface. Bishop's voice echoed from the approaching tunnel, closer now and carrying the sharp edge of command rather than persuasion. "Maintain formation. The ventilation shaft should be visible just beyond the next junction." Lantern light spilled around the bend, illuminating swirling dust motes and the first member of Bishop's party. Mercer, rifle carried at ready position despite the supposed absence of threats within the abandoned mine. The lieutenant's expression revealed tension that transcended ordinary caution, his eyes darting towards support beams and ceiling with evident concern about structural integrity. Behind him came Bennett, then Bishop himself, with Eleanor close beside him. Reynolds followed, his youthful features showing strain that suggested internal conflict as much as physical discomfort. Jenkins brought up the rear, constantly glancing behind as if expecting pursuit from unknown dangers lurking in the darkness they had traversed. Gideon shifted positions slightly, establishing clearer line of sight toward Eleanor. In the warm glow of the lanterns, he could see evidence of her ordeal in the torn blue dress and smudges of dust on her face. Yet she moved with characteristic dignity, spine straight and chin lifted despite circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Her gaze swept the junction as their party paused for brief rest, an orientation consultation. For a heartbeat, her eyes passed over the recess where Gideon and Nakohe waited, then returned, widening almost imperceptibly as she registered their presence in the shadows. No outward reaction betrayed this recognition, no gasp or sudden movement that might alert Bishop or his men, but Gideon saw awareness dawn in her expression, followed by carefully concealed hope and renewed determination. She knew they were there, waiting for opportunity to aid her escape from captivity. Bishop consulted his map, comparing it with the junction's features and apparent passages. The ventilation shaft should be directly ahead, approximately 30 yards along the central tunnel, he announced, folding the map and returning it to his vest pocket. Mercer, advance with caution. These tremors suggest instability increasing as we approach our objective. Eleanor's gaze flickered once more toward Gideon's position, communication passing between them without words or obvious signals. She understood they would follow and intervene when tactical advantage presented itself. Her task was simply to maintain the deception long enough for such opportunity to materialize. As Bishop's party prepared to continue forward, another tremor, stronger than those preceding, shook the junction. The central support beam cracked audibly, sagging beneath weight it had borne for decades. Dust and small rocks showered down, forcing men to cover their heads and lanterns to protect against potential injury and darkness. "Colonel, this entire section is compromised," Reynolds urged, genuine fear evident in his voice. "We need to retreat to the main shaft before—" "We advance," Bishop interrupted sharply, his hand moving to rest on his holstered revolver in implicit threat. "The objective lies directly ahead. I won't abandon the search when we're this close." The men exchanged glances that conveyed increasing reluctance to follow orders that might lead to their entombment. Even Mercer, whose loyalty derived from military discipline rather than ideological alignment, hesitated before proceeding into the central tunnel as directed. This fracturing of command cohesion created perfect conditions for the ambush Gideon had planned as contingency. He caught Nakohe's eye, a silent signal passing between them. They would allow Bishop's party to advance into the central tunnel, then follow at safe distance, waiting for maximum separation between Eleanor and her armed guards before making their move. As Bishop's men filed past their hidden position, Gideon's focus remained fixed on Eleanor, drawing strength from her composed determination despite desperate circumstances. Whatever dangers awaited deeper within the mountain, they would face them together. The bounty hunter and the Boston lady whose paths had converged through improbable circumstance and unlikely connection. Nakoe had said the prophecy's outcome depended on intention, destruction awaiting those with greed in their hearts, renewal for those protecting what was precious. As Gideon prepared to follow Bishop's party into the central tunnel, he knew with absolute certainty on which side of that division he stood. Eleanor Price had become more precious to him than any treasure, Confederate or Spanish, that might lie hidden within Las Aguilas' depths, and he would see her safely extracted from the mountain's embrace, whatever cost that rescue might demand. The central tunnel widened unexpectedly, its narrow confines giving way to a cavernous space that left the men blinking in surprise as their lanterns failed to illuminate the full dimensions of what could only be described as an underground chamber. Bishop's party halted at the threshold, momentarily awed by the unexpected expanse after hours of navigating claustrophobic passageways. "Hold the lanterns higher," Bishop ordered, his voice echoing strangely in the open space. "Circle formation, illuminate the perimeter." Mercer and Jenkins complied, raising their lights to reveal a roughly circular chamber, perhaps 40 feet in diameter. The ceiling arched overhead, its surface marked with glistening mineral deposits that caught and reflected the golden glow of their lamps. Multiple tunnel entrances, 6 or 7 in total, opened into the space like spokes radiating from a wheel hub, each a gaping mouth of darkness leading to unknown depths. A central junction, Reynolds observed, architectural training evident in his assessment. The Spanish engineers designed the mine around this natural cavern, using it as convergence point for multiple excavation routes. Eleanor moved slowly into the chamber, eyes adjusting to the interplay of light and shadow. The air felt different here, less stagnant than in the tunnels, with subtle currents suggesting ventilation from unseen sources. Her birthmark continued its strange warming, the sensation intensifying as she approached the far side of the chamber where a partial collapse had sealed one of the tunnel entrances. "This is the location," she announced, pointing toward the rock fall. "According to the cipher, what you seek lies beyond that collapsed section." Bishop stepped forward, examining the fallen rock with narrow-eyed assessment. "How convenient that our objective lies behind a cave-in," he remarked, suspicion edging his tone, almost as if someone wished to deter casual explorers. "Or as if the mountain itself sought to protect what lies within," Eleanor countered, the words emerging before she could consider their prudence. The strange warmth from her birthmark seemed to influence her thoughts, lending unexpected conviction to her improvised deception. Bishop gave her a sharp look, his composure showing cracks that revealed the obsession driving him. "Poetic notions have no place underground, Miss Price. Jenkins, Bennett, examine this collapse. Determine if we can safely clear sufficient rock to create passage." While the men assessed the rockfall, Bishop turned his attention to the chamber walls, where his lantern had revealed extensive petroglyphs, similar to those encountered in the tunnels, but more elaborate and numerous. The images covered nearly every accessible surface, their red ochre and black pigments remarkably vivid despite centuries of exposure to the mine's damp conditions. Eleanor watched Bishop's expression as he studied the ancient artwork, noting the growing unease that betrayed his attempted dismissal of native superstition. The petroglyphs here told unmistakable stories of warning. Human figures lying beneath toppled mountains, treasure seekers consumed by darkness, a central crescent symbol dominating each narrative panel in ways that echoed Eleanor's birthmark with unsettling precision. "Primitive attempts to discourage trespassers," Bishop muttered, though his repeated glances toward the images suggested they affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. Apache had no concept of mineral rights or property law. They simply wished to frighten away competitors for the region's resources. "The collapse can be cleared," Jenkins reported, interrupting Bishop's rationalization. "Looks deliberate. Large stones stacked rather than natural cave-in. Someone sealed this tunnel intentionally." "As expected," Bishop replied, confidence returning to his voice. "The Confederate officers who hid the treasury shipment would have secured their cash against discovery." He gestured impatiently. "Begin clearing. Carefully. We don't want to trigger additional collapse." As Jenkins and Bennett began the methodical process of removing rocks from the sealed entrance, Eleanor circled the chamber's perimeter, ostensibly examining petroglyphs, but actually assessing potential escape routes. The tunnel through which they had entered remained the most obvious option, but Bishop would certainly pursue her in that direction. She needed an alternative, preferably one unknown to their captors. Near the eastern edge of the chamber, partially concealed behind a natural rock column, Eleanor felt a distinct current of air against her cheek. Fresh air, carrying the faint scent of juniper and sage from the world above. She moved closer, discovering a narrow fissure in the rock wall, barely visible in the diffuse lantern light, but wide enough that a person might slip through if desperate enough. Her pulse quickened with hope. The fissure likely connected to one of the ventilation shafts that honeycombed the mountain, potentially offering a escape route to the surface. She memorized its location while ensuring her discovery remained unnoticed by Bishop, who had returned his attention to the men clearing the collapsed tunnel entrance. Reynolds appeared beside her, his movement casual but his positioning deliberate, between Eleanor and the rest of the group, obscuring their interaction from direct observation. "They've nearly created an opening," he murmured, voice barely audible beneath the sound of shifting rock. "The colonel intends you to enter first, ensuring there are no defensive measures beyond." Eleanor nodded slightly, having anticipated this development. Bishop would use her as human shield against potential traps, revealing his true regard for her safety despite previous pretenses of civility. "Be ready," she whispered back. "When I give the signal, move toward the entrance tunnel. Don't hesitate regardless of what happens." Reynolds swallowed visibly, conflict evident in his expression, but nodded agreement. Whatever moral calculation had occupied him during their descent into the mountain appeared to have reached resolution. He would help her when opportunity presented itself, despite years of loyalty to Bishop and his cause. "Colonel," Bennett called out, straightening from his crouched position before the rock fall. "We've cleared enough to create passage. There's a chamber beyond, but it's too dark to see details from here." Bishop strode forward, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes as he examined the opening. A rough-edged hole approximately 3 feet in diameter, darkness beyond suggesting space rather than immediate obstruction. "Pass a lantern through," he ordered. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Bennett extended his lamp through the opening, moving it slowly from side to side to illuminate whatever lay beyond. His expression shifted from concentration to confusion. "It's not what I expected, sir," he reported hesitantly. "There appears to be some kind of altar and objects arranged around it. Can't make out details from this angle." Bishop's composure faltered momentarily, doubt crossing his features before determination reasserted control. "We proceed as planned. Miss Price will enter first, confirm the absence of defensive measures." He turned to Eleanor, extending one hand in mock courtesy while the other rested meaningfully on his holstered revolver. "After you, my dear. Your grandmother's cipher has led us to this moment. It seems only fitting you should be first to witness what lies beyond." The threat beneath his genteel phrasing required no elaboration. Eleanor glanced toward Reynolds, who had positioned himself strategically near the chamber's main exit, then back to Bishop with carefully constructed acquiescence. "Of course, Colonel," she replied, moving toward the opening with outward composure that belied her racing heartbeat. "Though I maintain that my knowledge of the cipher is incomplete at best." Bishop's smile carried no warmth. "We shall soon determine the accuracy of your translation one way or another." Eleanor approached the collapsed tunnel entrance, now partially cleared to reveal an irregular opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. Jenkins handed her a small lantern, his expression betraying reluctant sympathy despite his rough exterior. The gesture suggested even Bishop's most hardened followers had begun questioning the treatment of a woman whose only crime was possessing an heirloom sought by desperate men. She knelt beside the opening, peering into darkness beyond, that the small lantern illuminated only partially. Taking a steadying breath, Eleanor began crawling through the narrow passage, careful of jagged rock edges that threatened to tear her already damaged dress or scrape exposed skin. The tunnel beyond the collapse was short, perhaps 8 feet of cleared natural fissure that opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but with higher ceiling that allowed her to stand upright once through. She raised the lantern, illuminating what lay before her, and involuntarily gasped at the sight that met her eyes. Not gold, not Confederate treasury cash, not Spanish silver ingots. Something far more profound and unexpected awaited in the hidden chamber. Something that suddenly made perfect, terrible sense of the prophecy, the petroglyphs, and the mountain's increasing anger at their intrusion. "What do you see?" Bishop demanded from the passage behind her, his voice sharp with impatience. "Report, Miss Price." Eleanor stepped further into the chamber, raising her lantern higher to illuminate the full extent of their discovery. Stone shelves had been carved directly into the rock walls, each bearing carefully arranged objects, pottery vessels decorated with geometric patterns, woven baskets containing what appeared to be corn and other preserved foodstuffs, beautifully crafted bone tools and weapons, ceremonial items adorned with feathers and beads, now faded with age but still recognizable. In the chamber's center stood a low stone platform, upon which rested the carefully arranged remains of what could only be tribal leaders or medicine people. The bodies had been naturally preserved in the cave's dry conditions, wrapped in deteriorated but still identifiable painted hides, and surrounded by possessions likely intended for use in the afterlife. Bows, quivers, medicine pouches, and personal ornaments crafted from shell, stone, and silver. Not treasure in the sense Bishop had pursued with such obsessive determination, but treasure nonetheless. Priceless archaeological and spiritual legacy of the Apache who had inhabited these mountains long before Spanish miners arrived seeking mineral wealth. "Miss Price," Bishop's voice held growing anger as he began pushing through the opening himself. "What have you found?" Eleanor turned as Bishop emerged into the burial chamber, his tall frame requiring awkward contortion to navigate the narrow passage. His expression transformed from anticipation to confusion, then disbelief as he raised his own lantern to survey the chamber's contents. "What is this?" he demanded, voice dangerously soft as he stepped fully into the space. "Where is the Confederate cache?" "There is no Confederate gold here, Colonel," Eleanor replied, calm despite the fury building in Bishop's eyes. "This is an Apache burial chamber, perhaps centuries old, judging by the artifacts. Your men must have mistaken references to this sacred site for indications of hidden treasure." "Impossible," Bishop snapped, striding toward the central platform to examine the remains and associated objects. "Our intelligence was precise. The treasury shipment was hidden in these mines during the war's final days." His gaze hardened as he turned back to Eleanor. "You've deliberately misled us. The actual cache must be elsewhere in the complex." Eleanor shook her head slowly, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. "There never was Confederate gold hidden here, Colonel. The Spanish documents you uncovered weren't referring to precious metals hidden by your compatriots during the war. They were documenting this burial site, perhaps intending to return and loot it once the original miners had departed." "She's right, Colonel," Reynolds said, having followed them into the chamber. His architectural training gave his assessment professional weight despite his youth. "These offerings weren't placed here recently. They've been undisturbed for generations, perhaps centuries. There's no evidence of Confederate presence." Bishop's composure cracked fully at these words, revealing the fanaticism that had driven him across years and territories in pursuit of phantom treasure. "Lies, all of it," he snarled, rounding on Eleanor with dangerous intensity. "You deliberately mistranslated the cipher, led us to this worthless collection of primitive artifacts while the actual treasury remains hidden elsewhere. I told you repeatedly that I had no special knowledge of the cipher," Eleanor countered, backing away from his advance while positioning herself closer to the chamber entrance. "My grandmother never explained the locket's significance. You created an elaborate fiction about Confederate gold based on coincidence and desperation." "The locket is the key," Bishop insisted, face flushed with rage as his years-long obsession collapsed before him. "The markings align perfectly with the Spanish survey maps. The Confederate officers who hid the shipment used existing cipher systems based on the locket's design. It cannot be mere coincidence." Mercer and Jenkins had pushed through into the burial chamber by then, their expressions revealing similar disappointment tinged with growing doubt about their mission's validity. Bennett remained in the main chamber, keeping watch on their exit route with diminishing conviction. "Colonel," Mercer ventured cautiously, "perhaps we should withdraw and reassess. The mountain's instability is increasing. We've explored the location indicated by the cipher and found no evidence of Confederate presence." "Silence!" Bishop thundered, his authority fraying visibly with each moment of confrontation with reality that contradicted his obsession. "The treasury shipment exists, 2 million in gold coin, entrusted to officers who remain loyal to the cause even after Appomattox. I will not abandon that objective because of this misdirection." During this exchange, Eleanor had carefully positioned herself near the chamber entrance, where Reynolds stood with growing uncertainty. She caught his eye briefly, a silent signal passing between them the moment approached when choice became action. "Look around you, Colonel," she said, gesturing toward the petroglyphs that covered the burial chamber walls much as they had the main cavern beyond. "The warnings have been here all along. The marked woman," she touched her birthmark briefly, "bringing destruction to those who enter the mountain with greed in their hearts. Primitive superstition," Bishop spat, though his gaze darted nervously toward the images she indicated. Figures lying beneath Collapse Mountain, treasure seekers consumed by darkness, the recurring crescent symbol dominating each narrative panel. "Then explain the tremors," Eleanor pressed, sensing his composure continuing to erode. "Explain the strange storm that lingers without rain. Explain how my grandmother's locket, passed through generations of my family, happens to match symbols carved by people who lived and died centuries before my ancestors left England." Bishop's hand moved to his revolver, desperation replacing calculation in his bearing. "Enough. You will accompany us back to the eastern tunnel. We will examine the alternate location, indicated by my own research. And if that proves equally unproductive, Miss Price, you will face consequences for your deliberate deception." The threat hung in the air between them, all pretense of gentlemanly civility abandoned in the face of thwarted obsession. But before Eleanor could respond, movement in the main chamber beyond caught her attention. Shadows shifting against lantern light, a whisper of sound that might have been footstep or falling stone. "We have company," Bennett called suddenly from his position near the main entrance. "Someone's—" His warning cut off in startled grunt, followed by the unmistakable sound of physical struggle. Bishop's head snapped toward the commotion, hand drawing his revolver in fluid motion that spoke of military training and battlefield experience. "Secure the girl," he barked at Jenkins. "Mercer, with me." But even as he issued these commands, chaos erupted in the main chamber beyond their position. A rifle shot cracked with deafening intensity in the confined space, followed by shouts and the sound of running feet. Bishop charged toward the passage, Mercer close behind with weapon drawn. Jenkins moved to grab Eleanor, but Reynolds intervened with surprising decisiveness, shouldering the older man aside with force that sent him stumbling against the stone platform. "This way," Reynolds urged, gripping Eleanor's arm and pulling her toward the chamber entrance. "Now, while they're distracted." They burst into the main cavern to find a scene of complete confusion. Bennett lay unconscious near one tunnel entrance, while Mercer crouched behind a rock formation, exchanging fire with unseen opponents positioned near the opposite side of the chamber. Bishop himself stood partially exposed, revolver aimed toward a shadow that moved with Apache stealth between columns of natural rock. "Gideon," Eleanor breathed, recognizing the fluid movement and steady aim of the bounty hunter even in the chaotic interplay of shadow and lantern light. As if hearing his name across the chamber's expanse, Gideon's gaze found her through the confusion. Relief flashed across his features, followed immediately by renewed determination as he noted her position and the young guard gripping her arm. Another shot rang out, this one from Nakohe's position near the eastern tunnel entrance, forcing Bishop to duck behind a natural stone column for cover. The distraction gave Reynolds opportunity to pull Eleanor toward the main exit tunnel, keeping low to avoid becoming targets themselves. "The passage we came through," he urged, voice tight with fear but resolve unwavering. "It's our best chance." Eleanor allowed him to guide her part way, then pulled back. "There's another way," she countered urgently. "A fissure in the eastern wall. It connects to ventilation shafts leading to the surface." Reynolds hesitated only briefly before nodding acceptance of her judgment. Together, they skirted the chamber's perimeter, keeping to shadows while the gunfight intensified between Bishop's men and their rescuers. The confined space magnified each shot to painful intensity, the sounds echoing and reverberating until it seemed the very mountain shook with their violence. In truth, it was shaking not merely from acoustic resonance, but from deeper disturbance. As if the ancient Apache burial site's violation had awakened forces dormant for centuries beneath the earth. With each exchanged shot, more dust and small stones showered down from the chamber ceiling. Support beams that had withstood decades of neglect now creaked ominously, wood fibers splitting audibly beneath strains they could no longer bear. Eleanor reached the fissure she had discovered earlier, still feeling the faint current of fresh air that promised potential escape route. She turned back, searching through gun smoke and shadow for Gideon, unwilling to flee without ensuring he knew her intended path. Their eyes met across the chamber, a moment of connection amid chaos that conveyed volumes without words. Gideon nodded once, sharp and decisive, then gestured urgently for her to continue while he provided covering fire against Bishop's increasingly desperate counterattack. A bullet struck the rock wall inches from Eleanor's head, showering her with stone fragments that stung her cheek and neck. Reynolds pulled her into the protective shadow of a natural column, shielding her with his body, as another shot went wild in their direction. "Go," he urged, pushing her toward the fissure. "I'll hold here. Make sure they don't follow." "Come with me," Eleanor countered, unwilling to abandon the young man to Bishop's vengeance should he discover Reynolds' betrayal. "Someone has to make sure you have time to escape," he replied with grim determination that transformed his youthful features into something approaching nobility. "I've chosen my side, Miss Price. Now go." Before she could protest further, a massive tremor shook the entire chamber with unprecedented force. Ancient support beams gave way with sounds like gunshots, sections of ceiling collapsing in showers of rock and choking dust. Bishop's voice rose above the destruction, still calling orders, even as his grand obsession literally crumbled around him. The locket. Find the girl and secure the locket. His fixation remained unshaken even as supporting timbers crashed down dangerously close to his position. Mercer had abandoned the fight entirely, making for the exit tunnel with survival instinct overriding loyalty to a commander whose obsession had led them into catastrophe. Jenkins was nowhere visible through the thickening dust, perhaps already fled or trapped beneath fallen rock. Eleanor turned toward the fissure, knowing her opportunity for escape diminished with each passing second as the chamber's structural integrity continued to fail. Yet still she hesitated, unwilling to leave without certainty that Gideon and Nakohi could follow. Reynolds made the decision for her, physically pushing her toward the narrow opening. "They'll find another way out," he insisted. "The Apache knows these tunnels. Go now or no one survives." With one last desperate glance toward Gideon's position, now obscured by billowing dust and continuing rockfall, Eleanor slipped into the narrow fissure. The space constricted immediately, forcing her to turn sideways and inch forward with agonizing slowness, while the sounds of destruction continued behind her. The mountain was fulfilling its prophecy with terrible precision, bringing ruin to those who had entered with greed in their hearts, just as the petroglyphs had warned across centuries. Eleanor could only pray that those of purer intention, Gideon, Nako, perhaps even Reynolds, in his belated moral awakening, would find the fortune of survival promised to those the mountain deemed worthy of its mercy. Behind her, the collapse accelerated, the rumble of falling rock pursuing her through the narrow passage as if the mountain itself urged her forward, away from destruction and toward whatever fate awaited beyond its wrathful judgment. Chapter 11. Collapse. The mountain breathed death. Dust choked the narrow tunnels, each breath a razor's edge of terror. Eleanor Price had faced uncertainty before, but nothing compared to the moment when the earth itself seemed to turn against them. The rotting timber supports groaned like dying men, splintering under tons of rock and centuries of geological weight. Gideon Kane moved like a panther through the chaos, his body a weapon honed by years of tracking and survival. Sweat cut clean paths through the grime on his face, his gray-blue eyes scanning for threats even as the mountain threatened to become their tomb. "Eleanor." His voice cut through the rumbling like a knife. She was already moving, the shooting lessons he'd taught her transforming her from a vulnerable widow to a woman of unexpected steel. The Colt revolver felt natural in her hand now, no longer a foreign object, but an extension of her will. Colonel Harlan Bishop's men scrambled like rats in a burning barn. The Confederate soldiers who'd once moved with military precision now fought only for their own survival. In the center of the madness stood Bishop himself, his immaculate suit now torn and dusty, his fanatical eyes burning with a hatred that transcended reason. "The map," Bishop roared, lunging toward Eleanor. "You'll not escape with my treasure." A young Confederate soldier. Reynolds caught Eleanor's eye. Something had changed in the boy. The blind loyalty that had driven him was gone, replaced by a desperate understanding of the moral chasm they'd crossed. "It's not worth it," Reynolds muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Knockaway, the Apache warrior, moved with a grace that defied the collapsing environment. His keen eyes locked onto Bishop, understanding that some threats must be neutralized completely. The mountain shuddered again. A massive timber support gave way with a sound like a cannon shot. "The mountain awakens!" Nekohe's voice carried an ancestral warning, a connection to something far deeper than the immediate chaos. Rocks crashed around them. Dust billowed like a living thing, obscuring vision, choking breath. Eleanor felt Gideon's hand, rough, strong, protective. Grab her arm and pull her close. "Stay with me," he growled, his breath hot against her ear. Bishop, mad with desperation, grabbed a collection of tribal artifacts, sacred items that had survived centuries, now clutched by hands that understood nothing of their true value. Reynolds stepped forward. "Stop!" The gunshot was sharp, precise. Reynolds crumpled, blood blossoming across his Confederate uniform. Eleanor rushed to him, her training forgotten in a moment of pure human compassion. "Why?" she whispered, cradling the dying young man. Reynolds coughed, a thin trail of blood marking his lips. "The prophecy?" he wheezed. "Protect the marked woman. Ruin comes to the greedy." Bishop laughed, a sound more terrifying than the mountain's collapse. He used Eleanor as a shield, pressing his revolver against her temple. "Not one step closer, Cain," Bishop snarled. Gideon's response was pure predatory focus. No words, just movement. Nakohe created a distraction, a war cry that echoed generations of Apache resistance. In that moment of confusion, Gideon struck. The fight was brutal, primal. Two men whose histories were carved by violence, now battling in the tomb of forgotten dreams. Fists struck, bones cracked. The mountain seemed to watch, bearing witness. Eleanor's fingers closed around her grandmother's locket, the key to everything and nothing. Bishop had sought it, died for it. And now, it meant nothing. As the final tunnel began to collapse, Gideon made a choice that would define him forever. Not revenge, not the treasure, but Eleanor's survival. He knocked Bishop unconscious, lifted him like a rag doll, and followed Nakohe's desperate guidance toward a secondary exit. The path was a nightmare of fallen rock and splintered timber. Eleanor's training with Gideon became their salvation. Each movement calculated, each breath measured. The air shaft, she remembered suddenly. Reynolds' final whispered words. Nakohe found it first. A vertical escape, narrow and treacherous. "Eleanor first," Gideon commanded. She climbed. Nakohe followed. And Gideon, always last, always protecting, made his desperate ascent as the mountain consumed everything behind them. They burst into sunlight just as the massive collapse consumed the abandoned mining settlement. Dust billowed like a funeral shroud. Distant screams were silenced by tons of rock. And then, water. Pure, clear water burst from the mountainside where moments before there had been only solid rock. The Apache warrior's eyes filled with reverence. "The prophecy," Nakohe whispered, "ruin to the greedy, fortune to the pure of heart." Gideon pulled Eleanor close. No words were necessary. They had survived. They had won. The desert, which had been their enemy, now offered its most precious gift, water. Redemption indeed. The late afternoon sun painted redemption in hues of amber and dust, just as it had countless times before, but nothing would be the same again. Eleanor Price sat tall in her saddle, her body aching from days of hard travel, her spirit somehow more whole than it had ever been. To her left rode Gideon Cain, his presence a wall of protection that seemed to part the very air around them. And beside them, Nakohe, the Apache warrior whose calm demeanor belied the momentous news they carried. 3 days had passed since the mountain had swallowed Colonel Harlan Bishop and his men. 3 days since water had burst from solid rock like a divine promise. The town seemed to hold its breath as they approached. Dust kicked up beneath their horses' hooves, a familiar dance of frontier life. But something had changed. Eleanor could feel it in the way people stopped and stared, in the hushed whispers that followed their approach. Marshal Thomas Reeves stepped forward, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster. The man who had once viewed Eleanor with suspicion now looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "Cain?" The marshal's voice cracked. "Eleanor Price? Nakohe, we heard no survivors." Gideon's laugh was low, touched with something between irony and triumph. Reports of our death were somewhat exaggerated. Eleanor felt his hand brush against hers, a subtle touch that spoke volumes. They had survived, more than survived. The mine, the marshal pressed, Bishop's men. Gideon's expression hardened. The story would not be hidden. Not anymore. Bishop was no treasure hunter, he began, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. He was a man consumed, using Eleanor, using a marriage promise to Thomas Mitchell as nothing more than a tool to decode a map to Confederate gold. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. Eleanor sat straighter, no longer the vulnerable widow who had arrived weeks ago. Now she was a woman who had faced death and emerged victorious. Nakohe, typically reserved, stepped forward. "We bring more than a story," he said, his English precise, his tone carrying the weight of prophecy. "We bring water." A beat of silence, then laughter, then skepticism. "Water?" someone called. "In this godforsaken desert?" But Nakoe was not a man to be dismissed. Not just water, a spring, enough to transform this land. The town elders emerged from the nearby meeting hall, their faces a mixture of curiosity and doubt. Old Man Henderson, the longest residing settler, squinted at the unlikely trio. "Prove it," he challenged. Within hours, riders returned from the mountain. Confirmation came like a thunderbolt. A spring, clear, abundant, enough to change everything. Redemption would never be the same. As the town erupted into celebration, Eleanor felt Gideon's arm encircle her waist. No words were necessary. They had found something far more precious than gold. They had found redemption. The Arizona Territory seemed to breathe with new life. Where dust and desperation had once ruled, hope now took root. As unexpected and vibrant as the spring that had burst from the mountainside. Eleanor Price stood on the porch of Gideon Kane's homestead, watching wagons roll into redemption like a river of possibility. 2 weeks had transformed everything. The town that had once teetered on survival now bustled with promise. New settlers arriving daily, their eyes bright with dreams of fertile land and fresh starts. Inside, Gideon was speaking with the town council. She could imagine the conversation, could nearly hear the respectful tones as they offered him the position of permanent marshal. The man who had once been feared as a lone bounty hunter was now seen as a protector, a beacon of justice. Her fingers traced the delicate locket around her neck, no longer a key to hidden treasure, but a memory of journeys survived. The door opened. Gideon's boots announced his arrival before she saw him, that familiar sound that had become as comfortable as her own heartbeat. "Well?" Eleanor turned, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. His grin was pure masculine satisfaction. "Seems the good people of Redemption want me to wear a badge officially." The preacher had been right. Circumstances had changed everything. Where once their relationship would have been viewed with suspicion, now the town saw them as saviors. The water source they'd discovered had transformed not just the land, but their very standing in the community. "I've sent the final letter," Gideon said softly, moving to stand beside her. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that spoke of intimate moments shared and battles survived together. Eleanor's breath caught. "To your sister? About the orphans," he nodded. "She'll be bringing the children west. We'll need to expand the house." The words were matter of fact, but his eyes held a vulnerability she'd come to cherish. The town had approached her about establishing a proper schoolhouse, not just for the settler children, but for the Apache children as well. A bridge between two worlds they'd never thought possible. The land around them was changing. Their home, the territory, their very lives. "We'll need more rooms," Eleanor said, her voice soft. A promise, a commitment. Gideon pulled her close. The setting sun painted the desert in hues of gold and amber, promising another day of possibility. Another chance at redemption. Their lips met. Not a passionate clash like their first kiss during the thunderstorm. This was different. A quiet claiming. A promise of forever. In the distance, a wagon rolled toward redemption. New settlers. New dreams. Their dream. Autumn light spilled like honey across the expanded homestead, casting long shadows through windows that had known too much emptiness before Eleanor arrived. The new schoolroom, a testament to their shared dreams, rang with the sounds of children learning, laughing, becoming. 3 orphans from St. Louis now called this place home. Gideon's sister had delivered them weeks ago, entrusting her brother with the most precious cargo she possessed, and Eleanor. Oh, Eleanor had transformed them from lost children to a family with nothing more than patience, love, and a worn primer. "Let's sound out the word again, Sarah," Eleanor coached, her hand gentle on the young girl's shoulder. Sarah, no more than 8, with her uncle's determined eyes, carefully traced each letter. The late afternoon sun signaled the end of lessons. Outside now, Eleanor instructed with a smile. Run and play before supper, giggles and shuffling feet, then silence. Gideon stood in the doorway, watching her. He'd been watching her a lot lately. Something was different in his eyes, something that made Eleanor's heart flutter like a caged bird desperate for freedom. He approached, hands behind his back, nervous, the great bounty hunter, nervous. "Eleanor," he began, his voice rough with emotion. She turned, waiting. From behind his back, he produced a small wooden box, handmade, simple, so like the man himself. Her breath caught. Gideon opened the box. A single gold band nestled inside, nothing ornate, just pure, simple gold. "This," he said, "is from the first bounty I ever collected. Honest money, not stolen. Not tainted." His fingers trembled slightly. "I kept it all these years. Waiting, I suppose. Though I didn't know what I was waiting for." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not one for flowery words," Gideon continued, "but I promise you this. I'll protect you, cherish you, build a life with you, not just here on this land, but in every way a man can promise a woman forever." The ring caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing like a promise. "The children need a mother," he added, almost as an afterthought. "And I need you." Laughter mixed with tears. Eleanor's hand reached out, touched the ring, touched his hand. "Yes," she whispered. Outside, the children's laughter drifted through open windows. The new spring bubbled nearby, a land transformed, a family born. Their future stretched before them, as vast and promising as the Arizona territory itself. Autumn draped redemption in a cloak of golden light. Cottonwood leaves danced on the breeze like nature's own celebration. Their amber and gold hues a perfect backdrop for a day of new beginnings. The spring that had changed everything bubbled nearby, crystal clear water catching the midday sun. A miracle born of prophecy and perseverance. Eleanor stood before the small mirror in the schoolhouse, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the blue ribbon at her waist, not the elaborate wedding gown of Eastern society, but a simple white dress that spoke of practicality and grace. Something borrowed, her grandmother's delicate lace collar. Something blue, the ribbon from her first journey west, now repurposed. Her fingers touched the locket. Inside now lay two portraits, her own and Gideon's, and her mother-in-law's cherished hairpin, a connection of families, of histories intertwined. Outside, the guests gathered, a tableau of unexpected harmony. Townspeople who had once viewed strangers with suspicion now stood shoulder to shoulder. Gideon's sister, her orphan children bright-eyed and scrubbed clean, and the Apache led by Nakohe and the medicine woman, a testament to a world changing. Nakohe would stand as Gideon's best man, a bridge between worlds that once seemed impossible to cross. The preacher cleared his throat. The crowd hushed. Gideon waited by the spring, dressed in his best suit, looking less like a bounty hunter and more like a man claiming his future. His eyes found Eleanor the moment she emerged. The medicine woman stepped forward first. Her hands moved in ancient gestures, words spoken in a language older than the territory itself. A blessing, a protection. "May the spirits guide your path," she intoned, her voice carrying the weight of generations. Gideon's gift came next. A deed to the land, both their names carefully inscribed. Not just a property transfer, but a promise of equality, of partnership. Eleanor's gift was more intimate. The hairpin from Gideon's mother now nestled in the locket that had brought them together, a circle completed. Their vows were simple, honest, stripped of unnecessary flourish. "I will protect you," Gideon said. "I will stand beside you," Eleanor responded. As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the spring seemed to bubble more vigorously. The Apache warriors nodded. The townspeople cheered. The harvest moon rose, casting silver light across the land they would call home. A woman who brought both ruin and redemption. A prophecy fulfilled. Their first dance was slow, intimate. A promise of everything yet to come. Epilogue. Full circle. The stagecoach kicked up a familiar dance of dust along Redemption's main street. a ritual as old as the territory itself. But everything had changed. Everything continued to change. Eleanor Kane stood at the edge of the boardwalk, her hand resting instinctively on her slightly rounded belly. The young woman stepping down from the coach looked lost, frightened, much as Eleanor had been a year ago. "Welcome to redemption," Eleanor said softly, extending her hand. The girl, no more than 19, with cornflower blue eyes and hair the color of wheat, clutched a worn carpet bag. "I'm Margaret," she stammered. "I'm to marry a rancher named James Cooper." Eleanor's smile carried wisdom beyond her years. "You'll be just fine." Gideon approached, his marshal's badge catching the afternoon sunlight. Where once he'd been a man feared by many, now he was redemption's protector. Children ran to him, no longer hiding. Settlers sought his counsel. The bounty hunter had become something far more valuable, a builder of community. The school behind them buzzed with life. Apache and settler children learned together, a testament to the changes Eleanor had championed. Desks filled with young minds, books open, futures expanding with each lesson. The medicine woman appeared as if summoned by thought itself. Ancient and powerful, she moved with a grace that defied her years. Her dark eyes found Eleanor, a knowing smile spreading across her weathered face. Her hand, rough with years of healing, touched Eleanor's belly. "The prophecy continues," she whispered in a mix of English and her native tongue. Gideon's arm wrapped around Eleanor's waist. No words were necessary. They had survived. They had transformed, not just themselves, but an entire territory. Their home, once a simple cabin, now stood as a beacon, expanded, welcoming, a center of hope. The sunset painted the desert in hues of gold and amber. Redemption spread out before them, a town born of water, of prophecy, of unexpected love. Their greatest adventure, Eleanor knew, was just beginning.